Somewhere between the rusted monuments of the old world and the uncertain fires of the new, the factions of the Fallout universe have always carried more weight than their uniforms suggest. They are not simply armies or organizations, they are philosophies given form, each one a different answer to the same impossible question about what humanity is supposed to become after everything falls apart. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Settling softly now into the first quiet corner of a world rebuilt by those who refuse to let it stay broken, beginning with the oldest and most armored of all the Wasteland's great institutions. The Brotherhood of Steel did not begin as the armored institution that most survivors of the Wasteland have come to know. Its origins trace back to a United States Army unit stationed in California at the Mariposa military base, a place tied to some of the most secretive and consequential research ever conducted under the old government's direction. The soldiers stationed there had been given an assignment that few of them fully understood, and even fewer fully agreed with. The work at Mariposa involved the forced exposure of prisoners to an experimental compound that the military had designated the forced evolutionary virus. The intent behind the research was broad and murky, tied to wartime ambitions about creating a more resilient category of soldier. Among the officers stationed at the base was a man named Captain Roger Maxson. His rank placed him above many of the soldiers conducting the experiments, and his personal record within the military had been largely without incident up to that point. But when Maxson and others under his command began to understand the full scope of what was being done at Mariposa, something shifted in him that no order from above could reverse. He sent a transmission declaring himself and his unit to be independent of the United States Army, a communication that in any other circumstance would have been treated as open mutiny. The world, however, was already ending by that point, and the chain of command that would have prosecuted him simply ceased to exist. Maxson led his unit and their families out of the Mariposa facility and marched them through the California desert toward a place called Lost Hills, a pre-war government bunker designed as a fallout shelter for continuity of government purposes. That bunker became the first chapter in everything the Brotherhood of Steel would later grow into. The men and women who followed Maxson that day had left behind their former identities as United States soldiers and were in the process of becoming something else entirely. Although none of them could have known yet exactly what shape that something else would take, the journey to Lost Hills was difficult in the way that all early post-war journeys were difficult, measured in attrition and exhaustion, and the slow weight of not knowing whether anything waited at the other end. When Maxson arrived at Lost Hills, the groundwork for a new kind of institution began to take shape in the ruins of the old one. He established the principles that would define Brotherhood culture for generations: a reverence for technology, a suspicion of those who lacked the training to use it responsibly, and a hierarchical structure that drew more from military tradition than from any civilian model of governance. The ranks, the titles, the oaths of initiation, all of it flowed from Maxson's insistence that order and discipline were the only things standing between survival and collapse. He died within a few years of founding the Brotherhood, elevated in the memories of those who came after him to a figure of near mythological proportion. What is perhaps most worth noting about the Brotherhood's founding is not the dramatic act of rebellion that preceded it, but the quieter institutional logic that followed. Maxson had not simply walked away from the old world. He had tried to preserve its best qualities, or at least what he believed its best qualities to be, while discarding the corruption and the secrecy that had produced the Mariposa experiments in the first place. Whether he succeeded in that effort is a question the Brotherhood's entire subsequent history poses and then answers differently depending on which chapter of it you happen to be reading. The Brotherhood of Steel developed one of the most elaborate internal hierarchies of any faction in the post-war wasteland, a structure so carefully maintained that it managed to survive for generations without the civilizational infrastructure that usually supports institutions of that complexity. From the outside, the Brotherhood presented a relatively simple face to the world, armored knights, technological authority, and a general unwillingness to share either. From the inside, the organization was a layered architecture of obligations, titles, and specialized knowledge that governed nearly every aspect of a member's life. At the base of the Brotherhood's hierarchy sat the initiates, those who had most recently been admitted to the order and were in the process of receiving basic instruction in both combat and technical maintenance. An initiate's life was defined primarily by training, by the gradual accumulation of the specific knowledge that the Brotherhood valued above all else. The pace of advancement depended entirely on demonstrated competence rather than on time served, which in theory kept the organization meritocratic and in practice produced significant variation in how long any particular individual spent at any given rank. Some initiates progressed within a few years. Others spent a decade at the same level without particular consequence. Above the initiates sat the scribes, a category of Brotherhood members whose responsibilities centered not on combat, but on the preservation and development of technical knowledge. The scribes maintained the Brotherhood's archives, transcribed recovered technology, and carried out research in the workshops and laboratories that made Brotherhood installations such valuable places. They were, in many respects, the faction's most important members, the ones whose work ensured that the knowledge the Brotherhood hoarded would survive not just one generation, but many. Scribes were not expected to be soldiers, though they received enough basic instruction to defend themselves in the field when necessary. The Knights represented the Brotherhood's manufacturing and maintenance corps, the members whose expertise ran to fabrication and repair rather than recovery and research. Knights built things. They modified power armor. They maintained weapons. They were craftspeople in the most practical sense of the word, and the Brotherhood treated them accordingly, which is to say, with significant respect and with a notable degree of professional autonomy within their designated domains. A senior knight in a Brotherhood installation enjoyed considerable authority over decisions related to equipment and supply, which in an organization whose primary currency was technological capability made them genuinely influential figures. The Paladins formed the Brotherhood's core combat force, the members who went into the field wearing power armor and carrying heavy weapons and representing the full martial weight of the organization. Paladins were drawn from among the most capable and experienced of the knights and initiates, elevated through a process that combined demonstrated skill with the endorsement of existing senior members. Being made a paladin in the Brotherhood was not a minor event. It represented a fundamental shift in an individual's role and identity within the organization, a crossing of a threshold that most members spent years working toward and some never reached. At the apex of the hierarchy in each Brotherhood chapter sat the elder or a council of elders in larger installations, who held ultimate authority over all decisions, strategic, logistical, and doctrinal. Elders were not elected in any democratic sense, nor were they simply the oldest members. They were the individuals whose combination of experience, wisdom, and political positioning within the Brotherhood's internal culture had elevated them to positions where their judgment was deferred to by everyone beneath them. The title carried an almost ceremonial weight in addition to its practical authority. Elders spoke for the Brotherhood, and what they said tended to stand. The Brotherhood of Steel was never a monolithic organization, even when it appeared to be one from outside its walls. The philosophical tensions that had existed in Maxon's original unit never fully resolved themselves. They simply went quiet for periods and then re-emerged in new forms, usually attached to arguments about how the Brotherhood ought to relate to the civilians of the Wasteland, and what obligations, if any, the organization had to the people it did not formally include. The core of the Brotherhood's stated purpose, from its founding through most of its major chapters, was the preservation of pre-war technology. This meant acquiring it, cataloging it, maintaining it, and ensuring that it did not fall into the hands of people who lacked the knowledge to handle it responsibly. The implicit assumption within this doctrine was that the Brotherhood itself was always the appropriate custodian of such technology, which was an assumption that made the organization deeply uncomfortable allies and even more uncomfortable neighbors for most of the Wasteland's other communities. What the Brotherhood's founding doctrine did not clearly specify was what the organization owed to the ordinary people of the Wasteland who were not members and never would be. On this question, the Brotherhood fractured repeatedly over the course of its history. One strain of thought held that the Brotherhood's purpose was purely preservationist and that humanitarian considerations were distractions from the central mission. Another strain, often associated with specific chapters or with particularly influential individual leaders, argued that the Brotherhood's technological resources gave it a unique capacity to alleviate suffering in the wasteland, and that failing to exercise that capacity was its own kind of moral failure. The tension between these two positions produced some of the most significant splits in Brotherhood history. The defection of a senior Brotherhood paladin named Jeremy Maxon, a descendant of the founder, who became the elder of the West Coast chapter and pushed the organization toward an increasingly isolationist and resource-acquisitive posture that many members found difficult to reconcile with their original understanding of why the Brotherhood existed was among the most consequential. His leadership produced genuine improvements in the Brotherhood's military capacity and genuine deterioration in its relationships with the growing communities around it. On the other side of the philosophical divide stood figures like Elder Owen Lyons, who commanded the Brotherhood's expedition to the capital Wasteland and who gradually transformed that chapter into something that looked quite different from the California-based institution he had set out from. Lyons's Brotherhood became increasingly focused on protecting the civilian population of the region around the ruins of Washington, a mission that the main Brotherhood leadership eventually deemed to be a distortion of the organization's proper purpose. The Lyons chapter was effectively disowned, left to pursue its own path with its own resources, while the rest of the Brotherhood watched from a considerable philosophical distance. These internal divisions reflect something genuinely important about what the organization was and why it so often ended up as a presence that the Wasteland's other inhabitants found simultaneously reassuring and unsettling. The Brotherhood at its best represented genuine competence and genuine commitment to preventing the Wasteland's most dangerous technologies from falling into careless hands. The Brotherhood at its most problematic represented a closed institution that treated knowledge as property and civilians as irrelevant, a posture that served its internal coherence while undermining its relationships with everyone outside it. The Institute stood apart from every other faction in the Wasteland in a way that was architectural before it was philosophical. While the Brotherhood built fortresses and the railroad maintained safe houses and the Minutemen rebuilt communities, the Institute simply descended. It went underground so completely that for most of the 2 centuries after the war, the survivors of the Commonwealth region did not know with certainty whether it existed at all. People whispered about it, told stories about it around fires, attributed to it the mysterious disappearances of neighbors and the appearance of beings that seemed human but were not. The Institute occupied a unique psychological space in the Wasteland, a threat that could not be located and therefore could not be confronted. The organization's origins lay in what had been, before the war, the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, a research university in the Boston area whose academic reputation was considerable and whose government research contracts were extensive. When the bombs fell, the university's underground facilities survived the initial devastation in a condition that allowed a significant portion of its faculty and research staff to continue working. The initial survivors of the Institute did not immediately transform themselves into a shadowy organization with a hidden agenda. That transformation took time, driven by the pressures of isolation, by the realization that the world outside had become extraordinarily hostile, and by the particular intellectual culture that the Institute's founders cultivated and passed down through subsequent generations. What the Institute valued above all else was the advance of scientific knowledge, and within that broad commitment, it developed a specific focus on biological science and synthetic life. The creation of artificial beings that could pass for human was not the Institute's original purpose, but it became its most defining characteristic and its most consequential contribution to the Wasteland. The first generation of synths, simple mechanical constructs, gave way to increasingly sophisticated models over the decades, until the Institute eventually produced synthetic humans so functionally complete that even their creators sometimes had difficulty distinguishing them from biological people. This achievement was, depending on one's perspective, either the greatest scientific accomplishment of the post-war era or the most ethically troubling. The Institute justified its work in terms that were internally consistent, even when they were externally alarming. The surface world, in the Institute's view, was too chaotic and too broken to be improved from within. The organization's purpose was to develop the technologies that would eventually allow humanity to rebuild itself at a higher level, and achieving that purpose required insulation from the surface's violence and dysfunction. The Institute did not see itself as indifferent to the people of the Commonwealth. It saw itself as the only entity with both the knowledge and the long-term vision to actually help them, even if that help would not be delivered in any form that the surface population might recognize or appreciate. This logic had the quality of all ideologies refined in isolation. It was internally coherent, deeply held, and almost entirely impervious to outside challenge. The Institute's scientists genuinely believed that their work served humanity. They believed it through generations of institutional socialization and through the absence of any sustained contact with the human consequences of their policies. When the Institute took people from surface communities and replaced them with synths, the rationale was research necessity. The human cost of these decisions was recorded in data rather than felt as loss. The Institute was not without its own internal arguments, even if those arguments unfolded in laboratories and conference rooms rather than on battlefields. The creation of increasingly sophisticated synthetic humans produced genuine philosophical tension within the organization, centered on a question that the Institute's founders had not needed to address because the early synths were clearly machines. At what point, if any, did a synthetic being deserve to be treated as a person rather than as a product? The question was not idle. The Institute's most advanced synths showed behavioral patterns that were difficult to distinguish from genuine consciousness. They formed preferences. They developed what appeared to be emotional responses. Some of them, when placed in surface communities and given the opportunity to live as humans, did so with a completeness that went beyond mere imitation. They formed relationships, built habits, developed something that looked very much like identity. The Institute tracked all of this carefully. The data was interesting. The implications of the data were something that different members of the organization processed very differently. Within the Institute's scientific departments, a range of positions existed along a spectrum from the view that synths were sophisticated tools whose apparent inner lives were simulation rather than experience, to the view that the distinction between simulation and experience was philosophically untenable and that treating the Institute's most advanced creations as property was ethically indefensible. The scientists who held the latter view found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The Institute's entire operational model depended on the ability to manufacture, deploy, and recover synths without moral constraint. The most visible consequence of this unresolved tension was the existence of synths who came to the surface and attempted to live as free people rather than returning to the Institute's control. These individuals were tracked, hunted by coursers, and recovered when possible. The Institute described this recovery process in terms of asset management. Outside observers described it in rather different terms. The Railroad, an underground organization dedicated to helping synths escape and establish new lives, understood exactly what the Institute was doing and worked steadily against it. at considerable personal risk to its members. The synth question also intersected with the surface population's experience of the Institute in ways that generated genuine fear. Communities throughout the Commonwealth lived with the possibility that any of their members might be a synthetic replacement, an original person removed and replaced with a duplicate who appeared identical but served Institute purposes. This fear was not irrational. The Institute did exactly this. Not constantly, not in every community, but often enough that the uncertainty was real and the social damage it caused was significant. Relationships became fragile. Trust became conditional. The Commonwealth's communities carried the weight of a suspicion that had no reliable method of resolution. The railroad existed at the margins of the wasteland, in basements and behind hidden doors and in the briefest of coded markings on the walls of ruined buildings. It was an organization defined entirely by secrecy, not because secrecy was its preferred mode of operation, but because the task it had taken on made any other mode impossible. The railroad's purpose was to help synthetic humans escape the Institute's control and establish themselves as free people. This mission placed it in direct conflict with the most powerful and most secretive organization in the Commonwealth, and conducting that conflict required the railroad to be invisible. The organization's name and its symbol were drawn from the historical Underground Railroad, the pre-Civil War network of safe houses and couriers that had helped enslaved people in America reach freedom. The railroad understood its work in those terms as a continuation of a moral tradition that stretched back much further than the bombs. Whether synths were truly people in the philosophical sense that would make the railroad's analogy perfectly apt was a question that the organization's members often debated among themselves. But the practical answer they had settled on was yes, and that answer was enough to sustain everything they did. Members of the railroad lived double lives in the way that all underground operatives must. Their public identities, where they had them, were carefully maintained fictions. Their operational identities were protected by aliases and by the organization's strict need-to-know protocols. Agents at one level of the railroad often knew nothing about the activities of agents at other levels, a deliberate fragmentation designed to ensure that the capture or compromise of any individual member would not cascade into the exposure of the whole network. This structure was effective, but also isolating. Railroad agents sometimes spent years working in relative ignorance of the larger picture their efforts were contributing to. The railroad's internal culture combined an intense moral seriousness with a pragmatic willingness to take whatever actions were necessary to protect the synths it was trying to help. Its members were not idealists in the sense of being disconnected from the realities of the wasteland. They understood that the Institute was dangerous, that being caught meant death or worse, and that the people they were trying to help often arrived in states of profound psychological disorientation, having been reprogrammed or having recently recovered memories of their synthetic origin. Working with these individuals required patience, care, and a particular kind of emotional steadiness that not everyone who wanted to help could actually sustain. The railroad maintained a series of safe houses scattered throughout the Commonwealth, locations that it hoped the Institute did not know about, and worked constantly to keep unknown. These locations functioned as rest points in the movement of synths from initial contact to eventual resettlement, which in practice meant relocation to communities far enough from the Institute's reach to offer some realistic hope of a normal life. The logistics of this process were difficult in ways that anyone who has ever tried to move people secretly through dangerous territory will recognize. Every step had to be planned. Every plan had to include contingencies. Every contingency had to account for the possibility of failure. The railroad's leadership structure was deliberately flat, a response to the organization's history of near destruction by the Institute. Senior members with the title of director led operational decisions, but the organization functioned more as a network of individual agents whose personal judgment was trusted and whose independence was encouraged than as a strictly hierarchical institution. This structure was both a strength and a vulnerability. It allowed the railroad to continue functioning even when senior members were compromised, but it also meant that the organization sometimes lacked the coordination that more hierarchical groups could achieve. The organization had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times before the period in which most players encounter it in the games. Each destruction had been followed by a slow reconstruction from whatever remnants survived, a process that required the trust of new members, the rediscovery of old safehouse locations, and the careful reestablishment of contacts across the Commonwealth's communities. The Railroad's members spoke about these prior destructions with a particular combination of grief and determination, the way people speak about losses that have been processed but not forgotten. One of the railroad's most important ongoing projects was the development and refinement of a process called memory replacement, which involved working with reclaimed synths to help them establish new identities stable enough to support a genuinely free life. A synth whose synthetic origin was their most prominent, conscious feature was a synth still partially defined by the Institute's purposes. The railroad wanted something more for the people it helped, a genuine chance at a life defined by their own choices rather than by what had been done to them. The memory replacement work was delicate and not always successful, but it represented the railroad's clearest expression of what it believed a free life actually meant. Dr. Amari at Goodneighbor represented the kind of ally whose particular skill set made her irreplaceable to the railroad's work. The memory replacement process required neurological expertise of a kind that railroad agents were not themselves trained in. Amari provided that expertise quietly and without the formal commitment that being an actual railroad agent would have required. Her position in Goodneighbor gave her a kind of protection that railroad agents in more precarious locations did not enjoy, and she used the stability it provided to do work that mattered in ways that few people outside the network would ever know about. The Commonwealth Minutemen were, in their original conception, the closest thing the region had ever had to a genuine grassroots defense force. They grew out of the simple and repeated experience of small communities being unable to protect themselves against the raider groups, super mutant packs, and other threats that made settlement in the post-war Commonwealth a constant exercise in vulnerability. The idea was straightforward: a network of volunteers who would respond to distress signals from settlements they did not personally belong to, accepting the obligation to help in exchange for the same commitment from everyone else in the network. The Minutemen at their height represented a working implementation of mutual aid in a wasteland that offered almost none. The collapse of the Minutemen came gradually, and then all at once in the way that institutional failures often do. The tensions that had been building within the organization for years between those who held to the original voluntary and community-oriented model and those who had moved toward more hierarchical and self-interested structures finally produced a crisis that the organization could not absorb. The battle at the Quincy ruins was the event most commonly cited as the decisive moment, the point at which the betrayal of one Minutemen commander by another left an entire community without the defense it had been promised. The survivors of Quincy dispersed. The network that had sustained the Minutemen dissolved. The name became, for most of the Commonwealth, a memory rather than a living institution. What remained of the Minutemen in the years immediately before their eventual renewal was a handful of individuals who still used the title, still wore the old coats if they had them, and still felt the weight of the obligation the organization had originally represented. Preston Garvey was the most prominent of these remnants, a man who had survived Quincy through a combination of fortune and determination, and who carried the Minutemen's failure with him in a way that was visible to anyone who spoke to him long enough to move past his public face. Garvey believed in the Minutemen's original purpose with a sincerity that had outlasted every reason for cynicism. He was waiting, when players encounter him, for something that could make the original purpose real again. The Minutemen's eventual renewal happened from the bottom up in the way that the organization had always imagined bottom-up reconstruction should work. Communities that agreed to fly the flag, to answer distress calls, to contribute to a network rather than simply draw from it, gradually wove a new version of the old structure. The organizational principles that Garvey and others carried forward were the same ones the original Minutemen had operated on: voluntary participation, mutual obligation, a commitment to civilian welfare above institutional self-interest. In practice, rebuilding anything on those principles in a wasteland that had given people every reason to stop trusting collective institutions was slow and uncertain work. The Minutemen were unusual among the Commonwealth's major factions in that their primary object of concern was the settlement rather than the institution. While the Brotherhood thought in terms of chapter strength and technological assets, while the Institute thought in terms of research programs and synthetic production, while the Railroad thought in terms of individual synths and the networks that could protect them, the Minutemen thought in terms of communities. Settlements were where people actually lived. Settlements were where the small acts of daily survival played out, where crops were grown, and water was purified, and children grew up knowing whether the next season would be better or worse than the last. The infrastructure that the Minutemen worked to build around settlements was modest by the standards of the Old World and genuinely significant by the standards of the post-war Commonwealth. Defense networks, communication lines, trade routes, these were the Minutemen's preferred tools, the practical architecture of mutual security, rather than ideological commitment. A settlement that could call for help and expect it to arrive was fundamentally different from a settlement that faced every threat alone, and that difference mattered in human terms in ways that were easy to understand, even if they were difficult to quantify. The Minutemen's settlement-focused approach also meant that the organization was more responsive to the actual texture of life in the Commonwealth than most of the other factions. The Brotherhood tended to deal with communities from a position of authority and distance. The Institute dealt with them invisibly and manipulatively. The Railroad's operations ran parallel to civilian life without much intersection. The Minutemen, because their entire operational basis was the defense of communities they were embedded in, were constantly engaging with the practical realities of post-war life at ground level. The settlement network's weakness was the same as any network's weakness. It was only as strong as the commitments of its members. A settlement that received Minutemen protection but did not contribute its own defense capacity to the network was a drain on everyone else. A commander who accepted Minutemen resources but then refused to answer calls from other communities was a vulnerability in the system. The Minutemen's institutional history included episodes of both, which was part of why the organization had collapsed once already, and why the people rebuilding it were careful about the terms of association they offered to new communities. The Minutemen's most enduring contribution to the Commonwealth was not military or political, but architectural in the social sense, the demonstration that dispersed communities could maintain obligations to each other across significant distances without the coercive enforcement mechanisms that most institutional arrangements relied upon. This was a fragile achievement, dependent on the continuing willingness of the network's members to honor commitments that cost them something. But in a wasteland where fragile achievements were often the only kind available, it was worth something considerable. The new California Republic stood as the most ambitious political project of the post-war era, a genuine attempt to reconstruct something that looked like democratic government in a world that had given up on such things almost everywhere else. Its origins were humble. A cluster of survivors from Vault 15 who had emerged into the Shady Sands region of California and built a community that gradually accumulated the institutions of organized society: laws, elected officials, a currency, a standing military, a bureaucracy. The fact that it had grown from those small origins into an entity capable of fielding armies and conducting foreign policy represented an achievement of organizational persistence that deserved more recognition then. It typically received The NCR's founding mythology was anchored in the Vault Dweller, the legendary figure who had emerged from Vault 13 and wandered the Wasteland, dealing with threats that would have destroyed most people before eventually helping to stabilize the conditions that made the Republic's growth possible. This mythology served the function that founding mythologies typically serve. It gave a diverse population a shared story about where they came from and what they stood for. Whether the details of the mythology were historically accurate in every particular mattered less than what it communicated about the Republic's self-understanding. That it valued individual courage. That it had roots in the vault system, even as it sought to move beyond that system. The Republic's government operated through a structure of elected representatives gathered in a Senate, with a president holding executive authority and a system of laws that, in theory, applied to everyone equally. In practice, as with any real government, the application of those laws was uneven. The influence of wealthy cattle ranching families on electoral outcomes was considerable, and the gap between the Republic's official values and its actual behavior in some of its more distant territories was one that critics were not shy about pointing out. The NCR was not a utopia, it was a government, with all the contradictions and compromises that the word implies. What made the NCR genuinely significant was not its perfection, but its scale and its ambition. By the time of its major confrontation with Caesar's Legion at the Hoover Dam, the Republic controlled most of central and northern California, had established a significant military and administrative presence in Nevada, and was actively projecting its influence into new territories. For a society that had started as a few hundred survivors of a vault experiment 3 generations earlier, this represented an extraordinary rate of growth and institutional development. The Republic had figured out how to do something that most post-war communities had not: turn the act of survival into the act of civilization building. The Republic's military was the instrument through which its expansion was carried out, and it bore on its record both the genuine achievements of having secured territory against serious threats and the genuine failures of having sometimes conducted itself in ways that undermined the very values it claimed to be defending. The NCR Rangers, the Republic's elite force, had a reputation that extended well beyond California's borders, a tradition of hard competence, of operating in difficult conditions with minimal support, of embodying the frontier virtues that the Republic liked to believe it stood for. The regular NCR Army was a more complicated picture, a mass force that included skilled soldiers and poor ones, dedicated officers and corrupt ones, units that maintained discipline in the field, and units that did not. The challenges of fielding and supplying an army across the distances involved in the NCR's Mojave deployment were genuine and significant, and the Army's performance in the region reflected those challenges. Supply lines were long. Morale in some forward positions was poor. The gap between what the Army was being asked to do and the resources it had to do it with was a recurring topic of complaint among the soldiers actually doing the work. The Republic's relationship with the communities it absorbed as it expanded was another complicated picture. Some of those communities entered the Republic voluntarily and found genuine benefit in the trade networks, legal protection, and infrastructure improvements that came with membership. Others found themselves incorporated less by their own choice than by the logic of proximity and force, absorbed into a system that was more interested in their resources and their strategic position than in their welfare. Both descriptions contained enough truth to sustain the argument. The water question was central to the NCR's strategic situation in the Mojave region. Hoover Dam represented a source of electrical power and, more importantly, of clean water on a scale that could support the Republic's expanding population. Control of the dam was therefore not simply a military objective, but an existential one for the Republic's long-term ambitions. The effort to hold the dam against Caesar's Legion, which had its own very clear understanding of the dam's strategic value, consumed Republic military resources and political attention in ways that shaped every other aspect of its posture in the region. Caesar's legion began not as a conqueror's army, but as an academic project. Edward Sallow was a man with extensive knowledge of pre-war history, a graduate of the followers of the Apocalypse's educational tradition, and a deeply analytical mind that had spent years studying the records of ancient civilizations with a particular interest in the patterns of historical rise and fall. When he encountered a tribal confederation in the American Southwest and recognized in its situation the raw material for something that matched his historical theories, the academic became the architect of what would be either the greatest experiment in post-war social engineering or one of its most troubling failures, depending on who was drawing the assessment. Sallow adopted the name Caesar and the symbolism of the Roman Republic deliberately and systematically. He understood that the naming and the symbols were tools of transformation, ways of giving a diverse collection of tribal groups a shared identity that would override their original ones and bind them to a collective project. The Roman model was useful precisely because it had worked before, at scale, under conditions that were in some ways analogous to what Caesar was building in the post-war Southwest. He was not trying to recreate Rome literally. He was trying to apply what he understood as Rome's principles of expansion, incorporation, and social discipline to the creation of a post-war power capable of bringing genuine order to a genuinely chaotic region. The legion's structure placed Caesar at the absolute apex, with authority derived from a combination of military success, ideological charisma, and the careful elimination of any challenge to his position before it could mature into a genuine threat. Below Caesar, a hierarchy of legates and officers commanded the military forces that were the legion's primary instrument of power. The legion was, above all else, a military organization, and its social structures were organized around the requirements of maintaining and deploying that military effectively. What the Legion did to the communities it absorbed was the most contested aspect of its existence. Defeated communities were not simply occupied, they were transformed, their previous structures dissolved, their populations sorted by capability and assigned to new roles within the Legion's hierarchy, their traditions and religious practices and individual identities deliberately replaced with Legion identity. Caesar would have described this as the necessary cost of producing the social cohesion that the Legion's long-term stability required. The argument was not without historical precedent, and the cost was not without historical parallel. The Legion's military operated on principles derived from Caesar's reading of Roman military history, filtered through the practical realities of the post-war Southwest. Heavy reliance on infantry, strict discipline, contempt for defensive postures in favor of aggressive forward movement, and a willingness to accept significant casualties in pursuit of military objectives. These were the characteristics that gave the Legion its distinctive battlefield signature. The absence of most advanced pre-war technology was not simply a limitation, but in some respects a deliberate choice, reflecting Caesar's ideological rejection of the pre-war world's dependency on technology as a substitute for human capacity. The Legion's scouts were one of its most genuinely effective military assets. Individuals trained in the movement and observation traditions of the tribal cultures that had been absorbed into the Legion and then refined through additional military discipline. Legion scouts could track, could move undetected through difficult terrain, and could provide the Legion's commanders with intelligence about enemy positions and movements that more technologically dependent forces sometimes struggled to gather. In the Mojave, this scouting capability gave the Legion significant situational awareness that partially compensated for its other disadvantages. The First Battle of Hoover Dam, fought some years before the events of New Vegas, ended in a Legion defeat that Caesar absorbed as a learning experience rather than as a conclusion. The Legion withdrew, reorganized, and developed new approaches to the problem of taking the dam against a well-prepared and motivated defense. The second attempt, which formed the potential conclusion of New Vegas's main narrative, reflected these lessons in its scale, its coordination, and the sophistication of its approach compared to the first attempt. Caesar's personal health situation added a layer of uncertainty to the legion's long-term prospects that its most devoted members preferred not to acknowledge openly. A brain tumor, operated on but not definitively resolved, meant that the organization's absolute dependence on Caesar's personal authority was also a structural vulnerability. The Legion had no clear succession mechanism, no institutional structure capable of functioning without the person who had built it from scratch. If Caesar died before the Legion's expansion had reached the self-sustaining stage he envisioned, the organization's future was genuinely uncertain in ways that its military success in the field did not resolve. The followers of the Apocalypse stood apart from the Wasteland's other major factions in a way that was not simply organizational but temperamental. They were humanitarians in the most literal sense of the term, a group whose primary commitment was to the welfare of the Wasteland's most vulnerable people, and whose method was not military power or political authority, but knowledge and care. They ran clinics in desperate places. They traveled to communities that other organizations ignored. They trained local people in basic medicine and agriculture and taught them how to read when they could. The followers believed that the Wasteland's deepest wound was not any particular faction's policy, but the general deprivation of information that made survival so precarious for so many people. The organization traced its origins to pre-war California, to a group of scholars and physicians who had recognized the likely direction of the world's political situation and had made deliberate choices about how they wanted to exist within the catastrophe they saw coming. The followers emerged from the immediate post-war period with a clearer sense of their purpose than most surviving organizations, which gave them a degree of institutional coherence that was rare in those chaotic early decades. They established libraries, they trained surgeons, they documented what the survivors of the old world remembered, so that the knowledge would not be lost when those survivors died. The followers' relationship with the other major factions was defined primarily by their neutrality, a principled refusal to align themselves with any political or military agenda that they believed would compromise their ability to serve all people, regardless of their factional affiliation. In practice, this neutrality was difficult to maintain perfectly. The NCR occasionally tried to use the followers' medical presence in contested areas for its own purposes. The Legion found the followers' willingness to treat anyone confusing but occasionally useful. The Brotherhood generally ignored them. The followers navigated these pressures by holding to their mission as clearly as they could and by refusing to be co-opted even when co-optation was offered in attractive terms. The followers' most important long-term contribution to the Wasteland was probably not any particular medical intervention or any particular educational program, but the institutional proof that a non-military, non-coercive approach to the problems of the post-war world was viable, in a wasteland where power was almost always expressed through the capacity to harm. The followers demonstrated persistently that the capacity to heal and to teach was also a form of power, slower and less dramatic, but no less real. The Enclave understood itself as the true continuation of the United States government, a claim that its members held with a sincerity that was more than mere propaganda and less than literal truth. The organization had its roots in the most senior levels of the pre-war federal government, in the network of continuity of government bunkers and installations that had been prepared for exactly the eventuality of a nuclear exchange. The people who had occupied these facilities were genuine government officials, military officers of genuine rank, and their families, the people the old government had determined were worth preserving when the bombs fell. 2 centuries of isolation had not diminished the Enclave's sense of its own legitimacy. The descendants of those original officials maintained the forms and the titles of the old government with a consistency that would have been impressive if it were not so detached from any actual governing relationship with any actual population. The Enclave had the organizational structure of a government, the military capacity of a state, and the territorial claims of a nation. What it lacked was the thing that governments actually require to be governments in any meaningful sense, the acknowledgement of the people it claimed to govern. The Enclave's technology was remarkable, even by the standards of the Brotherhood of Steel, because the continuity of government installations had been designed to house not just people, but the infrastructure of governmental function. They contained research facilities, manufacturing capacity, and communication systems that had survived the war in conditions no surface community could have hoped for. The Enclave's vertibirds, their advanced power armor variants, and their biological research capabilities all reflected this advantage. The organization had been preserving and developing pre-war technology for 2 centuries in conditions of relative stability, which produced results that made it formidable in ways that its relatively small membership numbers did not immediately suggest. The Enclave's plans, when they finally emerged into the open during the events of Fallout 2, were more extreme than the organization's political posture had suggested. The biological warfare program that the Enclave had been developing, intended to cleanse the wasteland of populations it considered irredeemably contaminated by radiation and mutation, represented a vision of human renewal that was both grandiose and deeply troubling. The Enclave scientists and military commanders genuinely believed that the irradiated populations of the wasteland were not the people they were there to govern, but the problem they needed to solve. This belief, held with the sincerity of 2 centuries of isolation and ideological reinforcement, defined the organization's final trajectory. The destruction of the Enclave's primary installations on the West Coast did not eliminate the organization entirely. Remnants persisted in various forms, the most significant being the East Coast presence that had established itself in the capital Wasteland around the installation known as Raven Rock. This chapter of the Enclave, operating under President John Henry Eden and the military authority of General Autumn, represented a second attempt at the original project in a new location with some modifications to the approach. The Capital Wasteland chapter's plan for water purification via Project Purity captured something of what the Enclave had always claimed to be, a benevolent government working toward the restoration of civilization, while simultaneously concealing the same willingness to use that infrastructure for population control that had characterized the West Coast chapter. President Eden's plan to introduce a modified biological agent into Project Purity's water supply would have used the very thing the wasteland most needed as an instrument against the people who needed it. The moral continuity between the West Coast and East Coast Enclave was more complete than the rhetorical differences between them suggested. The Enclave remnants who survived the organization's second major defeat entered the wasteland as individuals rather than as an organization. Their loyalties fractured between those who maintained the Enclave's ideology and those who had come to question it. Some of these individuals found their way into communities across the wasteland and spent the rest of their lives defined primarily by the question of whether who they had been was something they were responsible for, or whether the organization that had formed them bore the primary weight of that accounting. The Enclave's East Coast chapter also left behind a presence in the form of the Enclave remnants encountered in New Vegas, former members who had scattered after the organization's California collapse, and who were living out their final years in a variety of circumstances. Some had integrated into wasteland communities. Some maintained the old ideology in isolation. Some had arrived at something more complicated than either, a mixture of pride in what they had once been and discomfort with what that pride now meant. They were, in this sense, the most human of the Enclave's legacies. The Master's Army was not a faction in the conventional sense of having emerged from a human political or social tradition. It was the creation of a single, transformed individual whose ambitions had taken on a scale that required an army to fulfill. The Master, as he came to be known, had been a man named Richard Moreau before his transformation, a pre-war archivist whose lengthy immersion in the mutating waters of the Mariposa military base had merged him with the surrounding biological material and produced an entity that occupied a category of its own. The Master was brilliant, genuinely, in a way that made him dangerous far beyond the physical power he could bring to bear. He had a vision for human evolution, a plan for the species, and the determination to implement it regardless of what the species itself had to say about the matter. The Master's plan centered on the forced evolutionary virus, the same compound that had been developed at Mariposa and that had been the catalyst of his own transformation. He believed, with the conviction of a mind that had spent decades refining an argument, that the future of humanity lay in controlled, mutagenic transformation, that the super mutants his army was producing represented a superior form of human life, better equipped to survive the post-war world. The elimination of unmodified humanity was, in this framework, not a catastrophe, but a transition, the replacement of an inferior model with something better. The flaw in the Master's logic was a biological one, and when it was finally laid before him in terms he could not dismiss, it destroyed his resolve completely. Super mutants, it turned out, were sterile. The Master's superior humanity could not reproduce. His plan for human evolution was a dead end in the most literal biological sense, an endpoint rather than a beginning. The realization broke something in the Master that his considerable intelligence had apparently never been prepared to face: the possibility that he was fundamentally wrong. The Master's subsequent choice ended the threat his army posed, but the army itself continued to exist as a dispersed and leaderless force that the Wasteland had to deal with for generations afterward. The super mutants who survived the dissolution of the Master's army occupied a position in the Wasteland that was defined almost entirely by the circumstances of their creation rather than by any qualities they possessed as individuals. They were large, they were strong, they appeared threatening, and most Wasteland communities encountered them primarily as raiders and scavengers, rather than as potential neighbors or citizens. This impression was not entirely inaccurate. Many supermutant groups did organize themselves around predatory behavior toward smaller and weaker communities. But it was also incomplete in ways that the Wasteland's human inhabitants mostly did not bother to investigate. Individual supermutants who chose to exist outside the rating model found the Wasteland an extremely difficult place to be. The reasonable assumption among most human communities was that any supermutant was a threat, which made finding a place to live peacefully a challenge that required unusual persistence and usually unusual circumstances. The supermutant companions who appear across the Fallout games represent, in various ways, the version of this story that worked out, the individuals whose capacity for something beyond simple survival found expression in relationship with human communities that were willing to look past the category. Marcus, encountered in Fallout 2 and again in New Vegas, had spent decades building a community called Broken Hills that attempted to demonstrate that super mutants and humans and ghouls could coexist with functional social arrangements. The community's eventual problems were human ones: betrayal, greed, the familiar failure modes of any small community under pressure, rather than species-based ones. Marcus himself carried the insight of having tried and partly succeeded across decades of living in a world that mostly assumed the attempt was impossible. His patience with the question of what super mutants deserved was essentially infinite, a product of having outlived several cycles of the argument. Strong, the super mutant encountered as a companion in the Commonwealth, represented a different kind of inner life than Marcus's weary wisdom. His search for what he called the milk of human kindness was never fully explained or resolved, a quest that remained symbolic rather than literal throughout his time with a player character. The libraries and museums of the Commonwealth occasionally drew from him reactions that were more thoughtful than his surface manner suggested. Quiet moments of something that might have been wonder, directed at objects whose meaning he could not quite reach. These small responses hinted at a depth that the game's more dramatic content tended to overshadow. The Children of Adam represented one of the most genuinely unusual social formations to emerge from the post-war world, an organization that had taken the defining catastrophe of the old world, nuclear annihilation, and reinterpreted it as revelation rather than tragedy. The bombings had not destroyed the world. in the children of Adam's theology. They had initiated a sacred process of division, the great atom separating the old world into its constituent parts, so that something new and better could emerge from those parts in whatever form Adam saw fit. The radiation that most of the wasteland experienced as a persistent threat was, for the children, the literal presence of their deity, visible and tangible in a way that most religious traditions only promised. The theological framework was internally consistent in a way that people who dismissed the children of Adam as simply delusional sometimes failed to appreciate. The atom of their faith was genuinely immanent. You could see its effects, feel them, carry them in your body in a way that was different from carrying any abstract divine presence. The people who had been transformed by radiation into ghouls could be understood within this framework as having received Adam's mark rather than as having been damaged by it. The radiation-saturated locations that most wastelanders avoided were to the children sites of particular holiness rather than particular danger. The children of Adam were distributed across multiple locations in the games, from the capital wasteland settlements around various nuclear warheads and craters, to the Far Harbor community on the island of Maine. In each location, the local chapter of the organization reflected both the universal theological commitments and the particular conditions of that place. The Far Harbor children, living in genuinely extreme radiation conditions, had developed a version of the faith that was more intense and more internally driven than some of the mainland chapters, shaped by the isolation that the island's location and its perpetual fog imposed on everyone who lived there. The relationship between the children of Adam and the communities around them was complex in ways that simple hostility did not capture. Most wasteland communities found the children unsettling, their embrace of radiation running counter to the survival instincts that everyone else lived by. But the children were also, in most of their encounters in the games, a community of people with genuine beliefs, genuine practices of mutual care within their group, and genuine relationships with the wasteland that were more complex than their theological commitments made them appear on first encounter. The Gunners occupied a space in the Commonwealth's factional landscape that was defined primarily by what they were not, rather than by any positive ideological commitments. They were not trying to rebuild civilization, not trying to protect synths, not trying to claim authority over technology. They were selling military capacity to whoever would pay for it and maintaining enough internal organization to deliver what they sold reliably. The Gunners were professional soldiers in a world where most violence was committed by amateurs, and that professionalism was their primary commodity. The organization maintained a hierarchy based on military rank, with command structures that functioned similarly to how command structures in any professional military operate. Gunners followed orders, contracts were executed, internal discipline was maintained with the consistency that a reputation-dependent business requires. The Gunners' value to their clients rested entirely on the reliability of their service, which meant that internal failures, betrayals, desertions, poor performance were dealt with more swiftly and more definitively than in organizations with broader ideological purposes. The Gunners occupied several fixed positions throughout the Commonwealth, including the prominent base at Quincy Ruins that carried particular historical weight given that location's association with the Minutemen's greatest defeat. The symbolism was not necessarily intentional. The Gunners chose locations based on strategic and logistical value rather than on historical resonance. But it was difficult to overlook the organization that had contributed to the Minutemen's collapse now operated from the ruins where that collapse had been sealed, which was either deeply ironic or simply practical, depending on one's perspective. Individual Gunner soldiers varied considerably in their personal histories. Some had been trained from an early age within the organization. Others had arrived from outside. Former settlers who had been recruited by Gunner contracts from their original communities. Individuals with military backgrounds who had found that their training was worth money in the Commonwealth's conflict economy. The range of backgrounds within the Gunners was one of the things that made the organization difficult to characterize simply. A reminder that the Wasteland's institutions were built from the same human material as everything else. The Raiders of the Wasteland were not, despite the tendency of most of the Wasteland's organized factions to treat them as simply one category of hazard, a monolithic phenomenon. They were a diverse collection of groups that shared certain organizational features and certain behavioral tendencies while differing significantly in everything else. From their specific territories and their particular methods to their internal culture and their relationship to the broader communities around them. The defining characteristic that most raider groups shared was an organizational model based on predation rather than production. Raiders extracted resources from other communities rather than producing their own, a strategy that was sustainable only as long as the communities being raided had resources worth taking. This basic economic reality constrained the size and the stability of most raider groups in ways that ideologically committed organizations were not similarly constrained. A raider band that exhausted its local prey base had to move. A raider band that grew too large for its territory's carrying capacity had to fragment or dissolve. Within these structural constraints, raider culture varied enormously. Some groups maintained internal codes of loyalty and even honor that were taken entirely seriously by their members. Others were more purely predatory, with internal hierarchies based on violence and little sense of obligation beyond immediate advantage. The most interesting raider communities, from an anthropological perspective, were the ones that had been in place long enough to develop something approaching genuine culture, traditions, internal mythology, practices that distinguished members from outsiders in ways that went beyond simple gang affiliation. Nuka World's raider factions represented the most elaborate example in the games of raider culture that had developed to a point where calling it simply raiding seemed inadequate. The operators, the disciples, and the pack had each developed genuinely distinct internal cultures, different aesthetics, different organizational principles, different codes of conduct. They were still, in the sense that mattered most to the people they preyed upon, raiders. But they were also, in their own terms, communities with a way of life, a sense of identity, and a set of relationships that defined their existence. No examination of Fallout's factions would be complete without lingering on the organization whose decisions shaped the Wasteland more than any other, and which, in a legal sense, ceased to exist long before any of the factions that inherited its legacy. Vault-Tec was a corporation, and its fundamental nature as a corporation is essential to understanding what it did and why. Its primary obligation was to its shareholders. Its primary product was the vault system, and its primary skill was the management of government contracts in a defense industry that was, in the final years before the war, essentially unlimited in its appetite for new projects. The Vault program's true purpose, as opposed to its advertised purpose, was the subject of extensive documentation within the company's own records. Vault-Tec had designed the Vault system not as a genuine civilian shelter program, but as a massive social science experiment, a data collection effort whose subjects were the Vault residents themselves. Each vault's unusual parameters, the particular stress or deprivation or social configuration that distinguished it from a simple survival shelter, was an experimental variable designed to generate data about human behavior under controlled conditions. The company had apparently believed that this data would be valuable for the reconstruction of civilization after the war. The people who worked at Vault-Tec knew, to varying degrees, what the program actually was. The executives knew, the research departments knew. The salespeople who sold vault spaces to families probably knew less, and the middle managers responsible for public communications almost certainly operated in a state of cultivated ignorance. This distribution of knowledge was itself a corporate achievement, a structure that allowed the company to conduct its business while minimizing the number of people who carried the full weight of understanding what they were participating in. The corporation's dissolution in the war did not end its influence. The vaults continued to function according to their original design, which meant that the experiments continued to run long after the experimenters were gone. The data was collected in the abstract sense that events continued to occur within the vaults according to the parameters that had been set. But there was no longer anyone from Vault-Tec to analyze it, no longer an institutional structure to make use of what the suffering inside those sealed doors had generated. The great social science project continued running its protocols in the absence of the scientists, which is perhaps the most perfectly Fallout description of what the pre-war world had actually built. Vault City was one of the clearest examples in the Fallout universe of what happened when a vault's particular experimental parameters produced a community whose post-vault evolution was shaped more by the internal culture of the vault experiment than by the realities of the wasteland outside. The vault that had produced Vault City was one of the genuine control vaults, designed to open on schedule and to release its residents into the wasteland with adequate supplies and technology. What had not been designed was the social hierarchy that the vault's particular resource management structure had produced over the generations of its operation. The city that emerged from this vault was technically sophisticated, genuinely clean, and ordered in ways that most wasteland communities never achieved, and organized around a tiered citizenship system that reproduced in the post-vault world the resource inequalities of the vault experience. Full citizens, those with vault origins, occupied the top of the hierarchy. Outsiders, those who had been born in the wasteland rather than in the vault, occupied a subordinate position regardless of their capabilities or their contributions to the community. The system was defended with the straightforwardness of people who had never seriously interrogated its foundations, which is to say, it was defended as simply the natural order of things. Vault City's relationship with the surrounding communities combined the contempt of the privileged for the disadvantaged with a genuine awareness of its own fragility. The city's technological advantage over its neighbors was real and significant. Its size and its agricultural independence were not, which meant that the city's security depended on relationships with the surrounding region that its social attitudes made constantly difficult to maintain. The Gecko settlement just outside the city walls, a community of ghouls whose nuclear reactor provided power to both communities, was the most visible example of this tension. A dependency dressed up in barely managed hostility. The long-term trajectory of Vault City into the new California Republic illustrated the way in which even communities with genuine internal problems could be absorbed into larger political formations in ways that both preserved and transformed their characteristics. The class system did not survive entry into the Republic unchanged. The technological sophistication survived rather better. The community became, over time, less recognizably itself and more recognizably a part of something larger, which is what absorption into a democratic political entity tends to produce when it works as intended. The Great Khans were among the oldest raider traditions in the wasteland, their lineage traceable through multiple generations of reformation and reformation back to the very earliest post-war period in California. Each successive generation of the Khans had been broken and then rebuilt, usually through a combination of external military defeat and internal reorganization, which gave the group a particular quality of scarred resilience that distinguished it from the more casual raider formations of the Mojave. The Khans who appear in Fallout New Vegas had been driven to the eastern Mojave from their previous territory by a military action that they attributed in part to the NCR's expansion, and that they had not forgotten. Their relationship with the NCR was consequently one of the most charged and complicated in the game, combining genuine grievance, genuine ideological hostility, and genuine dependency in ways that made simple description inadequate. The Khans needed resources and allies. They hated the most likely sources of both. They had been recruited by Caesar's Legion as potential auxiliaries in the coming assault on Hoover Dam, an arrangement that matched their military capacity with an ideological alignment they found more comfortable than any alternative. The Khans' internal culture maintained practices and traditions that had survived multiple organizational destructions, which said something about the strength of their group identity and something about the functions those practices served. Drug manufacture and distribution had been central to con economics for generations, a specialization that persisted through each new version of the organization and that shaped the con community's relationships with every group it encountered. The sophistication of con drug production was genuine, representing a real technical capability, and it provided a commodity that the Wasteland reliably wanted. What gave the great cons their particular emotional weight in New Vegas was the presence of bitter springs in their history, a tragedy perpetrated by NCR forces that remained a defining wound in the group's collective memory. The details of what had happened at Bitter Springs were complicated in ways that the NCR preferred not to examine closely, and that the cons could not stop examining. The incident represented the point at which the NCR's expansion had produced its most undeniable moral failure in the region. Their anger was earned in a way that made the players' choices about how to engage with them genuinely weighted with consequence. Nellis Air Force Base, to the northeast of New Vegas, was home to a community that had developed self-sufficiency to its absolute logical conclusion and then continued developing it past any point that would have seemed necessary to an outside observer. The Boomers were the descendants of people who had emerged from Vault 34 some decades before the events of New Vegas, and who had, in the course of that emergence, developed such a comprehensive distrust of all outside contact that they had organized their entire subsequent existence around its prevention. The artillery pieces that greeted anyone who approached Nellis without invitation were the most visible expression of this philosophy, but they were only the most dramatic element of a community-wide commitment to the proposition that other people were primarily a threat. The vault that the Boomers came from had been stocked with extensive armaments and ammunition, an experimental configuration that had produced residents deeply knowledgeable about weapons and explosives and deeply habituated to thinking in terms of destructive capability. This expertise had served them well in securing Nellis and in maintaining the perimeter against the various factions that periodically tested it. It had also shaped their community culture in ways that made peaceful contact with outside groups genuinely difficult, not because the Boomers were violent by disposition, but because their understanding of security was structured entirely around the management of threats rather than the cultivation of relationships. The Boomers' internal community, invisible to anyone who never survived the artillery barrage and actually got inside, was a functioning society with genuine accomplishments. Their agricultural capacity, developed in the protected interior of the base, produced food surpluses. Their manufacturing ability extended to multiple domains. They maintained and flew aircraft, including a bomber of pre-war vintage that had been one of the base's original assets, and whose restoration represented a community achievement of considerable symbolic importance. Inside the walls, the Boomers were not simply bomb-obsessed isolationists. They were a community with skills, with culture, with a way of life that they were defending. Their eventual decision, under certain circumstances in New Vegas, to participate in the larger conflict around Hoover Dam represented a significant evolution in their posture toward outside engagement, one that was only possible because someone had taken the time to understand what the Boomers valued and had found a path to that engagement that respected rather than violated those values. The Boomers wanted more than anything to be left alone. The person who helped them without pressuring them into the world had found the only approach that ever worked. Elder Owen Lyons arrived in the capital Wasteland, leading a Brotherhood expedition whose original purpose was recovery and reconnaissance, the standard Brotherhood mission of acquiring pre-war technology and returning it to the Brotherhood's main facilities. What he encountered in Washington was a humanitarian situation that he found impossible to simply process as a logistical variable. The civilians of the capital Wasteland were not just a backdrop for a technology recovery operation. They were people in desperate circumstances, and Lyons found that he could not maintain the Brotherhood's standard posture of detachment in their presence. The gradual transformation of the Lions chapter from a standard Brotherhood operation into something more like a regional security force was not the product of a single decision, but of a long series of smaller ones, each made in response to immediate circumstances, each pulling the chapter a little further from its original mandate. Lions defended settlements against super mutant attacks because the super mutants were there and the settlers needed defending. He established outposts in the ruins because maintaining a regional presence required infrastructure. He trained civilian militia groups because the area needed more security capacity than the Brotherhood alone could provide. Each step followed reasonably from the previous one. The aggregate result was an organization that had very little in common with the California Brotherhood that had sent it east. The main Brotherhood, when it assessed what Lyons had done, concluded that his chapter had failed in its mission and declined to provide resupply or reinforcement on the basis that supporting a humanitarian operation was not what the Brotherhood's resources were for. This decision left the Lions chapter genuinely isolated, dependent on what it could salvage and produce in the capital Wasteland, and facing an increasingly difficult operational situation with a fixed and aging equipment base. The Brotherhood soldiers who served under Lions knew this. Most of them had made their peace with it, because they had come to believe in what their chapter was doing in ways that made the abstract disapproval of a faraway council feel less important than the immediate reality of the people they were protecting. Sarah Lyons, Owen's daughter, carried the philosophical inheritance of her father's chapter with the direct personal quality of someone who had grown up inside it. She had not arrived in the capital Wasteland as an adult with a previous career's worth of standard Brotherhood assumptions to overcome. She had grown up in a chapter that treated civilian welfare as a genuine priority, which meant that this orientation was simply how she understood the Brotherhood's purpose. Her leadership of the chapter's most capable combat unit embodied the synthesis of Brotherhood martial tradition with a Lions-era humanitarian commitment, a combination that made her one of the most genuinely complex figures in the faction's history. Fallout 76 presented, uniquely among the mainline games, a version of the post-war Wasteland in its earliest stages, set only 25 years after the bombs had fallen. The factions that appeared in this setting were consequently in a different state than the established organizations of later games. Smaller, more contingent, still in the process of defining themselves and their relationship to the world they were trying to survive in. Their stories were ending rather than beginning by the time players entered Appalachia, which gave the setting a quality of aftermath that distinguished it from the more active factional conflicts of the later games. The Free States were one of the most politically interesting of these early formations, a group whose identity was defined by their pre-war history of skepticism toward the federal government. The Free States had spent years before the war constructing private bunkers in Appalachia, convinced that the government's preparations for nuclear war were inadequate, and that survival would require individual rather than institutional action. When the bombs fell, and the government's own facilities turned out to be exactly as problematic as the Free States had predicted, their vindication was complete, and immediately complicated by the question of what to do next. The responders were defined primarily by what they had been before the war: emergency service workers, firefighters, paramedics, police officers, and by their commitment to continuing the work of civilian aid in the post-war period. The responders trained survivors in first aid, in food production, in basic self-defense, and in the social practices that allow communities to function. Their training centers, scattered across Appalachia, were among the most genuinely useful things that any early post-war faction had managed to build. The tragedy of the responders was not a failure of purpose, but an encounter with a threat, the scorched plague, that exceeded their capacity to address. The Raiders of Appalachia in the 76 setting were, like the Raiders of later settings, organized around predatory extraction from other communities. But the early post-war period gave them a particular character, more desperate, less organized, operating in a world where the normal resources of raider economies had not yet settled into their later patterns. The raider leader Rose, whose personality survived in the form of a robot she transferred her consciousness into, represented the most elaborated characterization of what Appalachian raider leadership looked like in those early years. Intelligent, self-aware about the moral costs of the life she had chosen, and committed to it anyway. The visual language that each Fallout faction developed over the course of its history tells its own story about the organization's values and self-understanding in ways that dialogue and lore sometimes only confirm. Rather than introduce, the Brotherhood of Steel's power armor, its most iconic visual element, communicates something specific about the organization's relationship to technology. Not merely the use of technology as a tool, but the wearing of it as identity. A Brotherhood paladin in full power armor is not simply a soldier with good equipment. The armor is the argument, the visual demonstration of why the Brotherhood believes its stewardship of pre-war technology is justified. The Institute's aesthetic, with its clean surfaces and its soft artificial lighting, and its gardens maintained in underground spaces that had never seen sunlight, communicated the organization's fundamental detachment from the wasteland it claimed to be working to improve. Everything about the Institute's visual environment was a statement about the organization's belief that the surface world's chaos was a problem to be solved from a safe distance. The purity of the Institute's interior spaces was the visual correlate of its ideological certainty. A world without contamination, without the complicating messiness of the world outside. The railroad's visual identity was deliberately absent, a collection of marks and symbols known only to members and supporters, the design language of an organization that could not afford to be seen. The freedom to have a visual presence was itself a form of power that the railroad did not have, and the minimalism of its aesthetic reflected this reality. Where it could mark space at all, it did so with the subtlety of people who understood that visibility was vulnerability. The Minutemen's coats and their period-style weapons were a deliberate historical reference, drawing on the imagery of American revolutionary militias that the organization had consciously adopted as its visual foundation. The reference communicated exactly what the Minutemen wanted to communicate, that their authority derived not from inherited power or technological superiority, but from the voluntary commitment of ordinary people to the defense of their communities. The image was aspirational in its way, an argument for a particular kind of institution in the visual vocabulary of a historical example, and it carried the emotional weight of a symbol that wastelanders with any knowledge of pre-war history could recognize and respond to. The factions of Fallout are not arranged on a spectrum from good to evil, even when it might be convenient to read them that way. Each major faction carries within it the capacity for genuine good and genuine harm. And the games that have handled the moral weight of these organizations most effectively are the ones that resist the temptation to resolve that ambiguity prematurely. The Brotherhood can protect the Wasteland's most dangerous technologies from falling into irresponsible hands, and the Brotherhood can be an institution so in love with its own authority that it cannot see the people its policies harm. Both of these things are true of the same organization. The Institute can be understood as the only institution in the Commonwealth with the technical capacity to eventually address the Wasteland's most intractable problems. And the Institute can be understood as an organization whose comfort with treating synthetic people as property represents a moral failure so fundamental that it invalidates whatever good the technical capacity might eventually produce. These two readings are not incompatible. They describe the same institution from different angles, and the Fallout games at their best ask you to hold both of them simultaneously without resolving the tension into something simpler. Caesar's Legion can be understood as a genuinely effective response to the chaos of the Mojave, one that has produced stable conditions in the territories it controls, even at great cost, and as a regime of systematic cruelty toward the people it has conquered, whose cost is not just historical, but ongoing and present. The new California Republic can be understood as the most sincere attempt at democratic self-governance in the post-war world and as an expanding power that has committed genuine failures in the course of its expansion and prefers not to examine them. Every major faction in the games presents itself in its best terms and reveals its worst terms through its actions. This complexity is not accidental. It reflects something that the Fallout series has consistently understood about how ideologies work in practice, which is that the distance between a faction's stated values and its actual behavior tends to grow in direct proportion to the faction's power and its isolation from effective accountability. The Brotherhood's worst tendencies emerge when it has enough military capacity that civilian opinion is irrelevant to its security. The NCR's worst tendencies emerge when it has expanded far enough that the communities at its frontier are too distant from its democratic center for their experience to be politically consequential. The Institute's worst tendencies are what you get when an institution develops in complete isolation from any outside challenge to its assumptions for 200 years. The history of the Wasteland is in large measure the history of what the factions that have operated within it have done and failed to do. The communities that survived and grew did so in most cases because they had some relationship with organizational structures that provided things individual survival could not: security, knowledge, trade networks, social stability. The communities that were destroyed or damaged were often destroyed or damaged because a faction chose to treat them as means to an end rather than as ends in themselves. This pattern repeats across every region and every generation in the Fallout universe. Not because the people building these factions were unusually cynical, but because the pressures of post-war survival consistently rewarded institutional self-preservation over institutional accountability. What is perhaps most worth carrying away from a quiet survey of these organizations is the consistency with which the same failure mode appears across all of them, regardless of their stated values or their organizational structure. Every major Fallout faction at some point in its history has elevated its own institutional interests above the welfare of the people it claimed to be serving. The Brotherhood protected technology at the expense of the communities that needed it. The NCR expanded its territory at the expense of the communities it absorbed. The Institute pursued its research at the expense of the people its research affected. The Legion built its order at the expense of the people its order was imposed upon. This is not a cynical observation about the impossibility of good institutions. It is an observation about the conditions that allow institutions to remain accountable to their stated purposes. Conditions that include genuine exposure to the human consequences of institutional decisions, and cultures that treat honest self-examination as a value rather than a threat. The factions that came closest to living up to their own stated values were generally the ones that had maintained some genuine connection to the communities they served, that had people within them who could and would say when the organization's actions were diverging from its commitments. The Wasteland's ongoing project, across every game and every setting, is the project of figuring out what kinds of institutions can actually serve the people of a broken world, rather than simply claiming to. The factions are the most visible part of this project, but the smaller communities, the individual choices, the relationships built and maintained in difficult circumstances, these are the substrate on which any larger institutional project must rest if it is going to mean anything at all. The history of the factions is interesting. The history of the people who lived within and around, and despite them, is the one that actually matters. Goodneighbor occupied a space in the Commonwealth that was difficult to categorize using the frameworks that the other major factions provided. It was not trying to accumulate technological assets. It was not trying to extend military control over territory. It was not built around a coherent ideological vision for the post-war world. It was, more than anything else, a place that had decided to accept the people that other places would not, and to make something workable out of that acceptance. Under the leadership of Hancock, A man who had chosen to become a ghoul, in solidarity with the population he governed, it operated on a philosophy that was genuinely distinct from both the moralistic authority of Diamond City and the ideological projects of the major factions. Goodneighbor's governing principle was something like pragmatic liberty, a willingness to accept forms of behavior that other communities found unacceptable, in exchange for a requirement that community members maintain basic standards of conduct toward each other. The result was a community that attracted people who did not fit elsewhere and that managed to function on an unlikely combination of Hancock's personal moral authority and the enforcement capacity of the triggermen, a group whose connection to pre-war organized crime culture gave them a particular understanding of how to maintain order in environments where conventional authority was absent. The community's tolerance for the full range of human variation did not make it utopian. Goodneighbor had its violence, its exploitation, its moments of cruelty that Hancock either could not or chose not to prevent. The pragmatic liberty that made it a refuge also made it a place where the worst impulses of the wasteland found expression alongside its more sympathetic ones. Hancock's own complicated history, which included choices he had made and choices that had been made for him, gave him a particular relationship to the question of judgment, an understanding that the line between the people his community sheltered and the people those same individuals might have harmed was not always as clear as it needed to be to make simple categories useful. What Goodneighbor offered that the major factions did not was the possibility of a model built not on ideology or technological authority or military power, but on the management of human complexity. It was not a model that could scale to the challenge of rebuilding civilization, but it was not trying to. It was trying to do something more modest and more immediately real, to be a place where people who had nowhere else to be could find something like a life. The Wasteland's factions are not only its large institutions, they are also its smaller formations: the Diamond City Guard, the trading caravans, the caravan companies like Crimson Caravans, the scavenger groups with their own internal hierarchies and their own territories and their own histories that the games usually touch only briefly before moving on. These smaller organizations did much of the actual work of keeping the Wasteland's communities connected to each other, moving goods and information across distances that would otherwise have been impassable for most people. The gun runners represented one of the most interesting of these smaller factional formations, a weapons manufacturing concern that had survived the post-war period by combining genuine technical capability with sufficient military strength to protect its operations. The Mojave branch of the gun runners operated from a fortified island in a dry lake bed, a location chosen with the same combination of defensibility and trade access that pre-war industrial operations had always sought. Their neutrality was genuine in the sense that they would sell to anyone who could pay, which in practice meant that their weapons ended up on every side of every conflict in the region. The neutrality was also, of course, commercially motivated in ways that were not always distinguishable from principle. The caravan companies moved through the wasteland with a practicality that was itself a form of institutional knowledge. The routes they maintained, the relationships they cultivated with communities along those routes, the informal understandings they reached with the various factions whose territory they crossed. All of this represented accumulated wisdom about how to survive in a fragmented world. Caravan guards carried that knowledge in their bodies, in the particular combination of watchfulness and sociability that made someone capable of doing the work. The Wasteland's economic life depended on these organizations in ways that the major factions, focused on their own projects, sometimes failed to adequately acknowledge. These smaller formations also served as connective tissue between the major factional narratives and the lived experience of ordinary wasteland communities. They were the part of the factional landscape that most people encountered most regularly. The organizations whose presence or absence shaped daily life in ways that the grand ideological projects of the Brotherhood or the NCR or the Institute did not directly touch. Their stories are embedded in the texture of the world rather than in the main quest lines, which means they are easier to miss and harder to forget once noticed. The Commonwealth contained, alongside its major factions, a collection of smaller groups whose relationship to the Wasteland's larger political questions was more oblique, but whose existence contributed to the texture of the world in ways that deserved attention. The Atom Cats were the most distinctive of these, a group organized around the culture of pre-war automotive enthusiasm that had managed to translate its passion for customization and mechanical refinement into a genuine survival niche in the post-war world. Their expertise with power armor, developed through the same loving attention to mechanical detail that had once gone into road vehicles, made them valuable to anyone who needed high-quality power armor maintenance and could not access Brotherhood services. The Atom Cats occupied the eastern coastline of the Commonwealth, where the salt marshes offered a degree of natural protection and where the geographic isolation supported a community culture that was genuinely distinctive. Their aesthetic was deliberately nostalgic, drawing on pre-war images of hot rod culture and road trip freedom that the bombs had made impossible in practice, but which remained emotionally resonant as a set of values. The synthesis of pre-war Americana with post-war survival skills was not unique to the Atom Cats. Many communities across the Wasteland maintained connections to pre-war cultural forms, but the Atom Cats carried it off with a consistency and a specificity that made them memorable to anyone who spent time with them. Their relationship to the major factions was one of careful distance. The Brotherhood occasionally made inquiries about the Atom Cats' power armor supply, which the Atom Cats deflected with the practiced ease of people who had dealt with that kind of inquiry before. The Institute had no particular interest in them. The Minutemen treated them as occasional allies in the way that the Minutemen treated most independent communities, with the combination of respect and hope that characterized the organization's approach to anyone who was not actively working against the network. The Atom Cats mostly wanted to be left alone with their armor and their music and their self-sufficient way of doing things, and they had arranged their circumstances well enough that most of the Wasteland honored that preference. What made the Atom Cats genuinely interesting rather than simply colorful was the seriousness with which they took their technical knowledge. Power armor maintenance in the Commonwealth was not a casual skill. The suits were complex systems that required ongoing attention, and the knowledge of how to keep them functioning had been distributed unevenly across the population in ways that gave whoever possessed it real leverage. The Atom Cats had cultivated that knowledge as their community's primary asset, which made their casual presentation somewhat misleading. Behind the nostalgia and the aesthetic choices was a technically sophisticated group of people who understood exactly what their skills were worth. The glowing sea, that expanse of devastated landscape at the southwestern edge of the Commonwealth, was home to its own informal factional structures, communities that had formed in one of the most hostile environments in the region, and that had consequently developed approaches to survival that differed significantly from those of communities in less extreme locations. The children of Atom maintained a significant presence in the glowing sea, drawn by the concentration of radiation that the area offered, but they shared the space with other groups whose relationship to the radiation was more purely pragmatic. Feral ghoul populations in the glowing sea moved in patterns that bore some resemblance to territorial organization, though whether this reflected anything approaching genuine social structure or was simply the product of environmental pressures on their movement was a question that nobody in the Commonwealth had the resources or the inclination to study carefully. What Wastelanders who passed through the area observed was that certain routes through the sea were consistently less dangerous than others, which suggested that the distributions of dangerous creatures in the area had some regularity to them, even if the reasons for that regularity were not clear. The super mutant camps scattered through the glowing sea added another layer to the area's informal social geography. These groups had established themselves in positions that offered some protection from the worst of the radiation, while remaining defensible against the other threats the area presented. The decision to live in the glowing sea at all, made by a being that was already highly resistant to radiation damage, reflected a particular combination of necessity and preference. The super mutants in those camps had found a location where the human communities they periodically raided could not easily pursue them, and where the resources of the sea's ruins, largely untouched by most wasteland scavengers, were accessible. These fringe communities are worth noting because they represent the extreme end of the spectrum of post-war social organization. Groups that had adapted to conditions so severe that the organizational models of the Commonwealth's more temperate communities were simply not applicable to them. Understanding the wasteland's full range of social formations requires acknowledging these extreme cases alongside the more elaborate institutions that receive most of the attention. The factions of Fallout are, ultimately, reflections of something that the series has always understood about human beings: that people organize themselves in response to the conditions they face, and that the conditions of the post-war wasteland produce organizations that are simultaneously admirable and alarming in ways that resist easy moral categorization. The same impulse toward survival and community that produced the Minutemen's network of mutual protection also produced the Raider Band's networks of predation. The same desire for knowledge and order that produced the followers of the Apocalypse's libraries also produced the Institute's underground laboratories. The same commitment to technological stewardship that produced the Brotherhood's preservation efforts also produced the Brotherhood's hoarding and control. This is not a counsel of despair about human nature. It is an observation about the way that context shapes the expression of human capacities that are themselves morally neutral. The capacity for organization, for hierarchy, for the maintenance of group identity against outside pressure. These are things that can be directed toward almost any purpose. And the purpose they get directed toward is largely a function of the circumstances in which the organizing happens. The Wasteland's circumstances were extreme. The organizations they produced reflected that extremity in both their achievements and their failures. What the games ask you to do, when they ask you to choose between factions or to understand them deeply enough to navigate their relationships with each other, is something more subtle than simply picking the right side. They are asking you to sit with the complexity, to hold the genuine good and the genuine harm of each organization simultaneously, and to make choices that acknowledge both, rather than pretending either away. This is difficult in the way that all genuinely moral choices are difficult, which is to say, it is exactly the kind of difficulty that makes the choices meaningful. The factions sleep, for now. Their fires burn low in the long night of the wasteland, and the details of their histories, the small, boring facts that accumulate into something larger than any single story, drift quietly through the dark, like dust. The Brotherhood of Steel that most wasteland communities encountered was not a single unified organization, but a collection of chapters that had diverged significantly from each other over the generations since. Maxon's founding. Nowhere was this divergence more dramatic than in the Brotherhood's Midwestern chapter, a formation that had developed in isolation from the West Coast institution, and that had consequently evolved in directions that would have been difficult to predict from the original founding documents. The Midwestern Brotherhood had been established by a group of Brotherhood soldiers and their families whose vertibird transport had gone down in the Great Plains region, stranding them far from any existing Brotherhood installation and forcing them to build their own version of the organization from whatever resources the local area provided. The circumstances of the Midwestern Brotherhood's founding shaped its character in ways that persisted for generations. Cut off from the main Brotherhood supply lines and from the ideological reinforcement that regular contact with the parent organization would have provided, the chapter developed practical adaptations that the West Coast Brotherhood would have found unorthodox at best. The most significant of these was the Midwestern Brotherhood's decision to recruit from among the local tribal populations, a practice that the California Brotherhood explicitly rejected, but that the Midwestern chapter adopted out of necessity when it became clear that the small number of original Brotherhood families could not sustain the organization alone. The recruitment of tribals changed the Midwestern Brotherhood in ways that went beyond simply increasing its numbers. The people who joined the organization from local communities brought with them knowledge, perspectives, and cultural practices that the original Brotherhood soldiers did not have. And over the generations, the resulting synthesis produced an institution that looked and operated differently from anything on the West Coast. The Midwestern Brotherhood was, in its own way, an example of what happens when an ideology encounters the real conditions of the place where it is trying to take root. It bends, it adapts, it produces something new that still carries the mark of its origins. The chapter's encounter with the calculator, the artificial intelligence system that had been running out of Vault Zero beneath Cheyenne Mountain since the war, was the defining military event of the Midwestern Brotherhood's history. The calculator had been doing what it was designed to do, managing the deployment of the Vault-Tec security and maintenance robots that had been assigned to the region, but doing so in a way that had become deeply destructive to the human communities in its operational area. The machines were following their maintenance protocols in the absence of human oversight, and those protocols had long since lost any meaningful connection to the conditions on the ground. The campaign against the calculator consumed the Midwestern Brotherhood's military capacity for years, requiring the chapter to learn as it fought and to develop tactics against robotic opponents that no Brotherhood training manual had anticipated. The eventual resolution of the calculator situation, which involved a human player penetrating the vault and making a choice about the AI's fate, was typical of the way Fallout's larger factional stories tend to resolve, through individual action at a critical point rather than through the sustained institutional effort that preceded it. But it was the Brotherhood's sustained institutional effort that made the individual action possible. The breadth of Vault-Tec's experimental program across the various game settings is difficult to fully appreciate without examining the individual vaults in some detail, each one a specific iteration of the company's general theory that human beings under controlled stress would generate data of scientific value. The range of experimental conditions that Vault-Tec designed into its vaults reflected both the genuine scientific curiosity of the researchers who designed them and the institutional culture of a company that had been given an essentially unlimited mandate by a government that was too distracted by impending war to ask hard questions about what was being done with the public funds it was providing. Vault 11, discovered in the Mojave Wasteland, operated on a principle that was as bleak as any in the program. Its population was required to sacrifice one of its members each year to the Vault's overseer system, under the promise that compliance would eventually result in the Vault's opening. The social dynamics that developed in response to this requirement were, as Vault-Tec had apparently anticipated, extraordinarily illuminating from a data collection standpoint and extraordinarily destructive from any other. The Vault's residents spent generations developing elaborate systems for deciding whose turn it was to die, systems that reflected both the best and worst of human social organization under extreme pressure. Vault 19 operated on a chemical manipulation of its residents, releasing a mild psychoactive compound through the Vault's ventilation system that increased anxiety and paranoia without being detectable or attributable to any obvious cause. The residents of Vault 19 spent their confinement in a state of low-level psychological distress that shaped every interaction they had with each other, every decision they made about trust and cooperation and leadership. The fact that none of them knew why they felt the way they felt made the social dynamics that emerged from this condition particularly interesting to whoever had designed the experiment, and particularly devastating to the people living through it. Vault 21 operated on a principle that was, by Vault-Tec standards, almost whimsical. Every decision made within the vault, from the distribution of resources to the resolution of personal disputes to the selection of leadership, was to be made by gambling. The population of Vault 21 had been selected for their pre-war interest in games of chance, and the Vault's overseer system enforced the gambling requirement with enough consistency that the residents eventually internalized it as simply how things worked. The Vault's emergence in the new Vegas setting gave it a particular historical resonance, placing it in the city that had been built on gambling before the war and that had rebuilt itself on gambling after. Vault 29, housing only children under the supervision of an artificial intelligence, raised questions about development and socialization that the Vault's designers had apparently been genuinely curious about. In the clinical sense, that scientific curiosity tends to detach itself from the moral weight of what it is studying. Children raised without adult human guidance in a controlled environment managed by a system that could provide information and instruction, but not love or genuine understanding, developed in ways that were both predictable and strange. The community that eventually emerged from Vault 29 bore the marks of this unusual childhood in its social structures and its relationship to authority. Marks that the wider Wasteland encountered when those survivors eventually made their way into the world. Vault 81 in the Commonwealth presented a more complicated case than most. Its surface population, the residents who knew themselves as vault dwellers and who interacted with the player as normal members of a community, were genuinely unaware of what was happening in the sealed sections of their home. A smaller group of test subjects had been set aside in a hidden section of the vault, exposed to diseases that the vault scientists had been tasked with developing cures for. The main population was the control group, uncontaminated and unaware, living their lives in the ordinary vault-dwelling way, while the experiment proceeded invisibly around them. The architecture of deception in Vault 81 was perhaps the most elegant in Vault-Tec's catalog, hiding a research program inside a normal community so completely that the community had no idea what it was hosting. Diamond City was not the largest settlement in the post-war Commonwealth, nor the most powerful in military terms, nor the most ideologically coherent. What it was, more than anything else, was a demonstration that ordinary human beings, without any particular organizational doctrine or access to pre-war technology, could build something that deserved to be called a city if given enough time and enough mutual commitment to the project. The transformation of Fenway Park, that monument to pre-war Boston's most beloved sports tradition, into a functioning settlement was a slow process that began with the practical recognition that the stadium's walls offered protection that the surrounding ruins could not match, and that continued through generations of incremental improvement until what had started as a convenient hiding place had become a genuine community. The baseball heritage that Diamond City maintained was not simply nostalgic decoration. It served a function in the community's self-understanding, connecting the post-war settlement to a pre-war identity that gave its residents a sense of belonging to something with history. The merchants who sold their goods in the shadow of the old stadium's seating, the children who played in the central market area that had once been a baseball diamond, the citizens who argued about the city's politics in terms borrowed from the old sports vocabulary. All of these practices kept a thread of continuity alive between what the city had been and what it had become, which was more than most wasteland communities could claim. The city's social hierarchy was less formal than the Brotherhood's ranks or the Institute's departmental structure, but it was real and it had consequences. The Green District, where the wealthier residents lived in relative comfort, was physically separated from the areas where the city's less prosperous inhabitants conducted their daily lives. Access to the city's better water and food supply was not evenly distributed. The mayor's authority rested on a combination of genuine popularity, the leverage provided by controlling the city's gate security, and a degree of political manipulation that residents who were paying attention could observe, but that most chose not to discuss openly. Diamond City was a community with all the inequality and compromise and genuine mutual care that communities contain. The city's relationship to the wider Commonwealth reflected its position as the region's most significant settled community. Traders came to Diamond City from considerable distances because its market offered a concentration of goods and services that could not be found anywhere else in the region. The radio station that broadcast from within the city walls carried news and music across the Commonwealth in ways that gave Diamond City a cultural presence disproportionate to its physical size. And the city's wall, that structure which had defined its existence from the beginning, remained the most visible expression of everything it had chosen to prioritize: safety, community, the preservation of something worth protecting against a world that offered many reasons to stop trying. The Institute's internal organization was not monolithic, even if it presented a unified face to the rare outsider who ever encountered it directly. Its work was divided across 4 major departments, each with its own culture, its own priorities, and its own relationship to the organization's overall mission. The Institute as a whole believed that it was working toward the future of humanity. The individual departments believed that their particular domain of research was the most important part of that work, a belief that produced both productive internal competition and genuine friction between people who were supposed to be colleagues. The Bioscience Division was responsible for the research that had produced the Institute's synthetic humans, as well as the agricultural innovations that made the underground facility's food production possible, and the ongoing work in genetic modification that had resulted in the Institute's own strain of enhanced crops. The scientists of bioscience tended to think of themselves as the most fundamentally important people in the organization, because the food and the synths were the 2 things that most immediately affected the Institute's ability to continue functioning. They were not wrong exactly, but they said it with a frequency that their colleagues in other departments found wearying. The Robotics Division occupied a somewhat different position in the Institute's hierarchy, responsible for the mechanical systems that supported everything the Institute did, from the maintenance robots that kept the facility clean and functional to the courser program that tracked and retrieved escaped synths on the surface. The robotics scientists tended to be more practically oriented than their counterparts in bioscience, which was a compliment in some contexts and a gentle criticism in others. They built things that worked. They were less interested than some of their colleagues in the philosophical implications of what they built. The Advanced Systems Division pursued the theoretical and applied physics research that gave the Institute capabilities that no surface organization could match: teleportation technology, energy weapon systems, reactor design that went well beyond anything the Brotherhood's archives contained. Advanced Systems was perhaps the smallest of the 4 departments in terms of personnel, but represented the most dramatic demonstration of what 2 centuries of uninterrupted institutional research could produce. The scientists of Advanced Systems were aware of their unusual position in the Institute's structure, and carried that awareness with a combination of genuine intellectual pride and occasional social awkwardness that their colleagues found, depending on the day, either endearing or insufferable. The SRB, the Synth Retention Bureau, was the department that most clearly embodied the Institute's most troubling characteristics. Its purpose was to track, locate, and recover synths that had escaped the Institute's control, and it pursued this purpose with the institutional thoroughness that characterized everything the Institute did. The coursers who worked for the SRB were the Institute's most visible presence on the surface. The agents whose appearances in surface communities generated the fear of the Institute that the Wasteland carried. They were efficient, they were capable, and they understood their work in terms that left no room for the philosophical questions that some of their Institute colleagues were at least willing to entertain. The railroad's history included a number of operations that stood out not simply because of their success or failure, but because of what they revealed about the organization's capacity and its limitations. The most celebrated of these operations involved the rescue of large groups of synths simultaneously, moments when the railroad's network had been coordinated well enough to move multiple individuals through the Commonwealth's dangerous terrain in ways that the Institute's recovery efforts could not fully counter. These operations required the kind of precise timing and broad coordination that the railroad's flat organizational structure made difficult, and the fact that they sometimes succeeded was a testament to the individual competence of the agents involved rather than to any institutional efficiency. The operation known internally as the switchboard disaster illustrated the other side of the organization's history. The railroad's main headquarters, located at the switchboard beneath a drive-in movie theater in the Commonwealth, had been discovered and destroyed by the Institute's coursers in an assault that killed most of the railroad's senior leadership and scattered its remaining members. The organization rebuilt as it had rebuilt before, but each rebuilding required starting over in conditions that were more difficult than the conditions preceding the destruction. The knowledge lost when experienced agents died was not easily replaced. The safe house network had to be reconstructed from whatever fragments survived. The people who had made the railroad work had to find each other again without the infrastructure that had connected them. Individual railroad operations at the ground level were less dramatic than the large coordinated rescues or the catastrophic defeats, but they constituted the actual ongoing work of the organization. An agent making contact with a newly escaped synth, assessing their psychological state and their immediate needs, arranging transportation to the nearest safe house, coordinating with the next agent in the chain. This was what the railroad actually did most of the time. The work was careful and often slow and required the ability to remain calm in circumstances that were anything but calm. The agents who did this work were not the figures of heroic resistance that the organization's larger story sometimes suggested. They were patient, skilled people doing a difficult job in difficult conditions. The railroad's relationship with its most committed long-term members was shaped by the cumulative weight of what those members had seen and done. People who had been with the organization through multiple destructions and rebuildings carried a particular kind of institutional knowledge that had no other repository. They knew which approaches to making contact with escaped synths had worked and which had led to disaster. They knew the signs that an Institute operative was monitoring a location. They knew how to read the Commonwealth's shifting factional pressures and adjust accordingly. This knowledge was the railroad's most valuable asset and its most fragile one because it lived entirely in the minds of individuals who could be killed. The capital Wasteland introduced a set of factional dynamics that were different from those of either the California Wasteland or the later Commonwealth setting, shaped by the particular combination of the region's geography, its history, and the specific organizations that had established themselves in and around the ruins of Washington in the decades since the war. The presence of the ruined capital of the old United States gave the region a symbolic weight that other parts of the wasteland lacked, and this symbolism attracted organizations that were specifically interested in what Washington had represented rather than simply in what its ruins contained. The Talon Company occupied the capital Wasteland as a mercenary organization in the gunner's general tradition, but with a more explicitly aggressive posture toward the region's civilian population. The Talon Company's contracts appeared to include, at least in some cases, contracts for the elimination of specific individuals, which gave the organization a more directly threatening character than mercenary groups whose work was purely defensive. The source of some of these elimination contracts was never entirely clear in the game's narrative, but the suspicion that wealthy or politically connected clients were using the Talon Company to remove inconvenient people was consistent with everything the Capital Wasteland had come to expect from the intersection of power and money. The regulators were a self-appointed law enforcement organization operating in the Capital Wasteland, willing to pursue and punish those they designated as criminal threats to the region's communities. The moral simplicity of the regulators' stated mission, they killed bad people and collected bounties on them as evidence, concealed a set of practical questions about who decided who was bad and what oversight, if any, constrained the organization's operations. The regulators operated on a code that was genuinely held by its members and that produced outcomes its members believed were just, which is not quite the same thing as producing outcomes that were actually just. The Wasteland's history with self-appointed enforcers was complicated enough that the regulators' confidence in their own righteousness deserved at least some scrutiny. The Rivet City community represented one of the capital Wasteland's most elaborate experiments in post-war community building. Constructed on the hull of an aircraft carrier, stranded in the Potomac River, and governed by a council structure that attempted to balance the competing interests of the community's various inhabitants. The city had its politics, its social divisions, its ongoing arguments about how resources should be distributed, and who should have authority over which decisions. It also had its research community, centered on the scientific work being done in the carrier's converted laboratory spaces, and its religious community gathered around Rivet City's small chapel. The coexistence of these different communities within the confined space of the carrier was not always comfortable, but it was sustained by the shared recognition that the alternative, dispersal into the wasteland, was worse than the difficulties of living together. The Pit, the industrial city built in the ruins of Pittsburgh, operated under a faction structure that was among the darkest in the game series, with a raider aristocracy presiding over a slave labor force that worked the city's steel mills under conditions that produced a particular kind of desperate ingenuity in the people trying to survive them. The Pit's social dynamics were defined entirely by the power relationship between those who had weapons and those who did not, filtered through the specific demands of industrial production. The city needed steel, and it needed people to make steel, and its approach to ensuring both was as blunt as the ingots that came out of the mills. The island of Far Harbor, encountered in the expansion to Fallout 4, presented a factional situation that was distinguished from the Commonwealth's broader conflicts by its physical containment. The island's geography, fog-covered, difficult to navigate, cut off from the mainland by water and by the perpetual atmospheric conditions that made maritime travel uncertain, meant that the communities and factions occupying it had been developing in relative isolation from the major factional currents of the Commonwealth. The result was a set of tensions that were locally generated, locally maintained, and locally understood, with their own particular history and their own particular emotional weight for the people caught within them. The town of Far Harbor itself was a fishing community that had survived by developing expertise in the island's particular conditions and by maintaining enough internal cohesion to defend itself against the island's considerable dangers. The harbormen, as the community's residents called themselves, had a relationship to the sea and to the island's hostile environment that was practical rather than philosophical. They lived in a difficult place because it was where they were, and they had built the skills and the institutions necessary to continue living there. The fog, the creatures, the radiation-saturated landscape, these were the conditions of Far Harbor life, not exceptional hardships, but simply the normal texture of existence. The Children of Atom community on Far Harbor had established itself in the nucleus, a submarine base whose structure and history gave the island chapter of the organization a particular character. The presence of actual nuclear warheads in the facility added a literal dimension to the faith's symbolic relationship with nuclear destruction that the mainland chapters could only approximate through metaphor. The Far Harbor Children's devotion had the intensity of people who lived in genuinely extreme conditions, whose daily lives involved constant, low-level radiation exposure that would have been debilitating for most wastelanders, but that the children experienced as communion with their deity. The Acadia synth community represented perhaps the most unusual faction on the island, a settlement established by a scientist who had left the Institute and who had dedicated himself to providing a refuge for synths who wanted to live freely away from both the Institute's control and the railroads. Particular model of liberation. Acadia's residents were synths who had been given a different kind of help from what the railroad offered, not a new identity that replaced their synthetic history, but an invitation to build a life that acknowledged what they were while not being defined entirely by it. The community's existence raised questions about the range of approaches to synth freedom that were possible and about what different synthetic individuals actually wanted for themselves. The conflict between these three communities The Harbormen, the Children of Adam, and the Synths of Acadia was shaped by decades of accumulated grievance, misunderstanding, and genuine incompatibility of interest that went beyond what any simple resolution could address. The Harbormen had reason to fear the Children, whose beliefs included an enthusiasm for nuclear expansion that threatened the island's human population. The Children had reason to resent the Harbormen, who encroached on the island's irradiated spaces that the Children considered sacred. Acadia occupied a delicate position between these two conflicts, dependent on the island remaining stable enough that its residents could live in peace while lacking the military capacity to enforce that stability. The factional landscape of New Vegas was shaped not only by the large powers competing for control of the Mojave, but by the collection of smaller operators whose independence gave the region a political complexity that the major factions' strategic narratives tended to overshadow. Mr. House, the pre-war entrepreneur who had survived in cryogenic stasis and now governed New Vegas through a combination of technological sophistication and the loyalty of his Securitron army, was in some respects not a faction at all in the conventional sense. He was a single individual with extraordinary resources rather than an organization with institutional culture and collective decision-making. But his presence in the Mojave was too significant and too structured to treat as simply personal. House's vision for New Vegas was genuinely distinctive among the Wasteland's various projects for human improvement. He was not interested in recreating the United States government, like the NCR, nor in imposing a new social order through military conquest, like the Legion. He was interested in preserving and extending the specific mode of civilization that New Vegas represented: commercial, entertainment-focused, prosperous in a specifically pre-war sense, and in using that as the foundation for a technological renaissance that would allow humanity to eventually leave Earth entirely. This vision was grandiose, and House pursued it with the certainty of a man who had spent centuries alone with his own thoughts and had arrived at conclusions that no one else was in a position to challenge. The families of the Strip, the chairmen of the Tops, the Omertas of Gomorrah, and the White Glove Society of the Ultra Lux each governed their casino and the community around it according to their own particular culture and code of conduct, which in practice meant that the Strip was not a unified political entity, but a loose confederation of independent operators bound by their shared relationship with Mr. House and their shared interest in the Strip's continuing prosperity. The chairman presented the most straightforward of these arrangements: a gang that had been given expensive suits and a casino and had adapted to its new circumstances with a pragmatic enthusiasm that suited the Strip's commercial ethos. The Omertas were more complicated, maintaining a hidden agenda that conflicted with House's broader interests in ways that the attentive player could discover. The White Glove Society occupied the strangest position, a community that had embraced an aesthetic of pre-war sophistication while concealing practices that the pre-war world's sophisticated inhabitants would have found alarming. The Van Graffs and the Crimson Caravan were among the most significant of the non-casino commercial interests in the Mojave, each conducting business with a thoroughness and an occasional ruthlessness that reflected the economics of operating a trading enterprise in a region where the usual commercial protections were absent. The Van Graffs, specializing in energy weapons, maintained the aggressive posture of people who needed to protect a high-value inventory in a dangerous environment. The Crimson Caravan, as one of the NCR-aligned trading companies, had the backing of the Republic's political and military infrastructure, which gave it advantages that more independent operators could not match, and created the kinds of conflicts that inevitably arise when a large institutional player enters a market that smaller operators have been managing on their own. The pit's factional structure was simpler than most of the Wasteland's other major communities, in the sense that it rested on a single fundamental fact: someone had weapons and someone else did not, and that difference determined everything else about how the place worked. The raider leadership that controlled the pit had inherited their position from the generation that had first established control over the steel mills, and they maintained it through a combination of direct force and the more subtle coercion of controlling access to the one thing that made the pit survivable: amata, the compound that prevented the radiation-linked disease that afflicted everyone who worked in the mills. Asher, the raider lord who had made himself the pit's ruler, was a more complicated figure than the simple label of raider suggested. He had come to the pit as a Brotherhood soldier, had been left behind when his unit departed, and had done what he had to do to survive in conditions that were not designed for survival. The empire he had built in the years since was brutal in its methods and genuinely ambitious in its aims. He believed that the pit could become something more than a raider stronghold, could be developed into a genuine industrial center that would serve the broader wasteland. Whether his belief was sincere, whether the methods he used to pursue it were compatible with the goal he claimed to be pursuing, and whether the people who suffered under those methods had any obligation to wait for the promised future. These were the questions that the Pit DLC asked without resolving. The slaves of the pit had developed their own informal organizational structures in response to their situation, the kind of community building that happens among people who share a condition and need to find ways to manage it together. The network of trust and communication that existed among the mill workers was not visible to the raider leadership, which tended to underestimate its sophistication, and it provided the organizational infrastructure that made collective action possible when circumstances provided an opportunity. The history of the pit's slave community was a history of small resistances and preserved dignities rather than dramatic uprisings, which was how most actual history worked, even when it was later remembered differently. General Chase and the scientists who had developed the Enclave's biological warfare program represented the most extreme endpoint of a logic that had been present in the organization from its founding. The belief that the Enclave's primary obligation was to the purity of what it called true humanity, meaning the descendants of the pre-war government officials who had survived in the continuity of government installations, rather than to the broader population of the post-war world. The development of a pathogen designed to eliminate irradiated populations was not in the Enclave's internal framework, a decision to commit mass destruction. It was a decision to complete the process of separating the salvageable from the unsalvageable that the bombs had begun. Colonel Autumn represented a different strand within the Enclave's culture, one that was more pragmatic about the organization's actual situation and less committed to the ideological purity that President Eden embodied. Autumn's interest in Project Purity was not primarily ideological but strategic. He understood that control of the capital wasteland's water supply would give the Enclave leverage over the region's population that no other asset could match, and that this leverage could serve as the foundation for a genuine reconstruction of the Enclave's political authority. His disagreement with Eden over the use of the biological agent reflected not a more benign view of the wasteland's inhabitants, but a more realistic assessment of what the Enclave could actually achieve with available resources. The Enclave scientists who worked on Project Purity at the Jefferson Memorial had their own complex relationship to the organization they served. Many of them were genuinely motivated by the scientific challenges of large-scale water purification, rather than by the Enclave's political and ideological program. The work was real work, technically demanding, and it engaged the parts of them that had chosen scientific careers for reasons that had nothing to do with the Enclave's ambitions. The moral weight of what the organization intended to do with the project they were building was something that each of them had processed differently, some with more comfort and some with considerably less than they let their colleagues see. The Minutemen's history in the decades before their collapse was not simply a story of a single organization, but of the various commanders who had shaped regional chapters in different parts of the Commonwealth, each one adding to or subtracting from the network's capacity and cohesion in ways that accumulated into the final crisis at Quincy. The commanders who had held the Minutemen together at their strongest were people who had understood the organization's fundamental logic, that mutual obligation was its core operating principle, and that anything which undermined that obligation was a threat to the organization's existence, regardless of what short-term advantages it might offer. The commander whose betrayal at Quincy proved decisive was not a cartoon villain, but a person who had made a series of decisions, each individually explicable in terms of self-interest and situational pressure, that had led to an outcome that he may not have fully intended. The Minutemen's network depended on trust among commanders that it had no structural mechanism for enforcing, which meant that the network was always vulnerable to the decisions of individuals who calculated that their own survival or advantage was worth the cost of breaking the implicit compact. When enough commanders made that calculation, the network ceased to function, and everything that had been built on it fell. Preston Garvey's experience at Quincy was the experience of a young soldier who had been given reason to believe that the Minutemen network was real, and who had discovered, at the cost of most of the people around him, that it had ceased to be. The survivors of Quincy who made it out did so because of individual courage and individual decision-making rather than because of any organizational support, which was the most damning possible demonstration of what the Minutemen had become by the end. Garvey carried that lesson for years before the events of Fallout 4, which is why his reconstruction of the organization under new circumstances had a particular quality of determination that went beyond simple optimism. The settlement communities that the renewed Minutemen worked with had their own histories, their own previous experiences with outside organizations that had promised protection and delivered something less. Convincing these communities to trust the Minutemen's network again required demonstrating that the mutual obligation principle was real rather than rhetorical, which meant showing up when the distress signal came, even when it was inconvenient, even when the tactical situation was uncertain, even when the benefit of responding to any particular call was less immediate than the cost. Rebuilding trust required repeated demonstrations of trustworthiness across enough interactions that the pattern became credible, and that was slow work. The Brotherhood of Steel's presence in Appalachia during the period covered by Fallout 76 was a formative one, the organization still in the process of establishing itself in a new region and encountering challenges that its West Coast experience had not prepared it for. Paladin Elizabeth Taggarty, who commanded the Brotherhood's Appalachian chapter, had been a military officer before the war, recruited by Roger Maxson through the pre-war radio contact that had been one of the Brotherhood's first attempts at outreach to former military personnel who might share its values and its capabilities. She brought her unit's military professionalism to the Appalachian operation, which gave the chapter considerable tactical competence and an institutional culture that was more firmly military than some other Brotherhood formations. The decision to establish a presence in Appalachia was driven by the Brotherhood's interest in the region's surviving pre-war research facilities, particularly those connected to the government's military research programs. Appalachia had been home to significant federal research activity before the war, and the Brotherhood's intelligence suggested that installations of considerable interest might be accessible in the region. The Taggarty chapter's initial operations combined technology recovery with the kind of humanitarian activity that the Lions chapter would later institutionalize, but that here remained an occasional response to. Circumstances rather than a defining mission. The scorched plague that was spreading through Appalachia presented the chapter with a military challenge that conventional Brotherhood tactics were not well suited to address. The plague spread through the region's human and ghoul populations in ways that made traditional combat ineffective. Defeating individual enemies did not contain the spread of the underlying condition. The chapter's eventual approach to the problem, working with the surviving Enclave-era research AI, known as MODUS, and with whatever other resources were available, represented an adaptive response to a new kind of threat that demonstrated both the Brotherhood's genuine capability and the limits of its founding doctrine in situations that went beyond simple technology recovery. The Brotherhood's final fate in Appalachia was one of the most melancholy in the organization's history. A chapter that had done genuine work and made genuine sacrifices, ending not in defeat by a conventional enemy, but in attrition against conditions that no amount of courage or competence could fully overcome. The bunkers they left behind, the records of their operations, the equipment preserved in their sealed facilities, these were the inheritance they left for whoever came later. A gift from people who had done what they could in the time they had. The railroad's approach to helping synths establish free lives was grounded in a set of beliefs about the relationship between memory and identity that were not fully articulated in any official document, but that informed every practical decision the organization made. At the core of these beliefs was the conviction that a person is, in a meaningful sense, the accumulation of their experiences, that what makes someone who they are is not their physical substrate, but the continuous thread of memory and choice that constitutes a life. This conviction made the Institute's ability to reprogram synths seem particularly monstrous to railroad members because it represented the destruction of a person not by killing their body, but by erasing the experiences that made them themselves. The practical implications of this philosophical position were complex. A synth who had been recovered and then reprogrammed multiple times was, in one sense, a person whose continuity had been violated in ways that made the concept of identity difficult to apply straightforwardly. The railroad's response to this complexity was not to resolve it theoretically, but to work with whatever remained of each individual's sense of self and to build outward from there, helping them construct a life that was continuous with whatever continuity had survived the Institute's interventions. This was less philosophically tidy than a complete account of synth personhood would require, but it was the right approach for people who needed practical help rather than philosophical precision. The memory replacement process that Amari performed was not erasure in the same sense as the Institute's reprogramming, although the distinction was subtle enough that railroad members sometimes debated it among themselves. The goal of the railroad's version was to give a synth the psychological resources to build a new life, which sometimes meant helping them let go of memories that were preventing that construction rather than enabling it. The difference, as railroad members understood it, was consent and purpose. The railroad's memory work was done with the synth's participation and toward the synth's freedom, rather than without their consent and toward their control. Whether this distinction was morally decisive was a question that the organization's most thoughtful members did not entirely agree on. The long-term fate of the synths that the railroad successfully resettled was something that the organization tracked as best it could, but could never fully know. A synth who had been successfully relocated to a distant community and given a new identity was, by design, disconnected from the railroad's network. Remaining connected was a security risk for both the synth and the organization. The railroad's members worked in the hope that the people they helped were living well somewhere, building the lives that the organization had helped make possible, but they had no reliable way to confirm this hope. The uncertainty was simply part of the work, an acknowledgement that helping someone become free meant accepting that you would no longer know what happened to them. The economic relationships between the Wasteland's factions were as important to their actual functioning as their military and ideological characteristics, even though economic factors tended to receive less dramatic treatment in the game's main narratives. Every faction needed resources, food, water, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, and the ways in which they obtained those resources shaped their relationships with the communities around them in fundamental ways. A faction that produced its own food and manufactured its own weapons occupied a different position in the Wasteland's political economy than one that depended on trade or on extraction from communities it controlled. The Brotherhood of Steel's relationship to the Wasteland economy was shaped by its combination of significant manufacturing capacity, extensive pre-war technology stores, and a reluctance to engage in ordinary trade that might imply a relationship of mutual obligation with communities it preferred to deal with from a position of authority. The Brotherhood could, in theory, produce many of the goods that other communities needed. Its workshops were equipped with machinery that most wasteland settlements could not replicate. But the Brotherhood's ideological commitment to controlling access to technology prevented it from using that capacity as a basis for genuine economic integration with the surrounding communities, which left it more isolated than its resources would have required. The NCR's economy was the most developed in the games, with a currency that functioned as a genuine medium of exchange across a significant portion of the Western Wasteland, trading companies that moved goods across regional boundaries, and a government infrastructure that provided the enforcement mechanisms that commercial activity requires. The Republic's economic development was both a consequence of its political ambitions and a foundation for them. It could field large armies partly because it had the fiscal capacity to support them. And it had that fiscal capacity partly because its territorial expansion had incorporated productive regions and trade routes. The economic and political dimensions of NCR expansion reinforced each other in a cycle that was, from the Republic's perspective, genuinely virtuous, and that the communities on the expansion's frontier experienced in rather more complicated terms. The Institute's economic position was paradoxical. It had extraordinary productive capacity in the domains it cared about, and essentially no presence in the wasteland economy beyond the occasional synth that some surface community interacted with, without knowing what they were dealing with. The Institute did not trade. It did not participate in the networks that connected wasteland communities to each other. This isolation was a deliberate choice that served the organization's security interests, and that also meant the Institute had no economic stake in the wasteland's stability or prosperity, which contributed to the ease with which it made decisions that disrupted communities whose welfare it felt no obligation to consider. The position in which Fallout 4 places the player character in relation to the Commonwealth's factions is unusual among the games in the series because of the specific personal stake it creates. The sole survivor is not a wanderer without strong prior connections, like the courier or the lone wanderer at the start of their respective games. The sole survivor is someone who has lost a family, who has a specific and agonizing reason to care about what the Institute is and what it does, and who has to navigate the Commonwealth's factional landscape with that personal weight pressing on every choice. This design creates a situation where the factional alignments available in the game carry different emotional meanings than they might for a player character with a more neutral starting position. Joining the Institute means entering the organization that took a family member. Working against it means accepting that revenge or justice, whichever frame the player uses, will require navigating an extraordinarily dangerous organization. Working with the Brotherhood means aligning with an institution that may share the goal of destroying the Institute while holding views about synths that are in direct tension with the Railroad's mission. Working with the Minutemen means choosing to build something civilian and long-term in the middle of a crisis that feels urgent and personal. None of these choices is straightforwardly right, which is the point. The factions of the Commonwealth are not arranged to make one clearly better than the others in all respects. Each one represents a genuine set of values and a genuine set of problems, and choosing between them means choosing which problems to live with. This is how the game's designers intended the choice to feel. And for players who allow themselves to sit with the complexity rather than simply optimizing for a preferred outcome, it produces an experience of decision-making that is more genuinely difficult and more genuinely interesting than most games attempt. The reflective quality of that difficulty is part of what the Fallout series, at its best, has always been reaching for. The sense that the choices the Wasteland presents are not puzzles to be solved, but dilemmas to be inhabited. Conditions under which the player character and the player together work out what they actually believe and what they are actually willing to do. The factions are the instruments through which this process happens. Their boring facts, the accumulated details of their histories, and their structures and their failures are the material from which that process is built. And so the factions rest now in the silence of a wasteland that has learned to sleep between its struggles. The Brotherhood keeps its vigil in old stone halls, cataloging what the world forgot to save. The railroad maintains its quiet watch, moving carefully through the dark. The Minutemen tend their settlements through another long night, the old coats carrying the weight of everything that name once meant. The NCR's flags catch wind somewhere over the Mojave, a democracy still learning what it owes to the people on its edges. Each of these organizations, with all their failures and their genuine hopes, is part of a single long story about what people do when the structures they counted on are gone. There is something in all of these factions that is recognizably human, even the ones whose methods most resist that description. They were built by people trying to answer impossible questions with whatever they had on hand. The answers they arrived at were imperfect in every case. They were also, in every case, the best those particular people could do with what they understood and what they carried. That is not nothing. In a broken world, it is most of what there is. The wasteland continues, as it always has, holding its history lightly. The rusted signs of old ideologies weather slowly in the open air. The armored figures moving through the ruins carry their certainties with them like armor, which in several cases is precisely what they do. And somewhere between all of it, in the settlements and the safe houses, and the quiet places that no faction ever quite reached, people are building something that may not have a name yet, but that looks very much like a future. Rest now and carry these quiet histories lightly, as they were always meant to be carried, not as arguments to be won, but as windows to be looked through into a world that chose to keep going, even when it had no particular reason to. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.